code review of an actual viewer's project that was submitted in. We're going to go over what we like about it, what we don't like about it, and some interesting details that I think some of the guys have found. And then we're going to talk about a couple other topics, maybe take some questions along the way as well. Before we get started, and before I say hello to everybody again one more time, I wanted to mention the Lego Ninjago game jam that Unity is doing. I put a link down below so you can go check it out. I did a stream or a set of streams throughout the week talking about it and building out a game for it to submit, and then did a little bit more work on it yesterday, and I'm going to put out a video showing the whole process and talking about it sometime this week. So make sure you're subscribed for that and go check out this I guess just the jam and see if you're interested in submitting a game to it. It doesn't seem very difficult. You could probably knock something out in a couple hours, and it's a lot of fun. So thanks, guys, for coming out and joining me and joining everybody else. And I guess thanks to all of the people that are here with us live. And yeah, welcome.
Hey, all.
Hello.
Jason.
Sorry, hey, my coffee's just kicking in. Give me a break.
All right, yeah, my rock star is kind of kicking in too. It's a little bit early. I've just started drinking. I think this is my second one for the morning to get going, to get waking up. So how's your guys' week's been? Pretty good, or anything interesting going on?
Lots of things going on at work, and I've been trying to make a Unity project of my own, trying to make the most needlessly complex combat system, so I have a lot of fun stories from that.
Oh, nice. A complex combat system. What type of game, by the way? We'll talk about it later, but I'm curious, what's the game type?
Devil May Cry style.
Oh, okay. Making a nice, complicated, some with the animations. This is probably related to that timeline stuff you're talking about before, huh?
Yeah.
We'll definitely have to dive into that. What about you, Jason?
Main things I've been doing. So on the work project I'm on, I'm currently doing a lot of DevOps stuff. So that's kind of fun because it's nice when you get to pull from experience that you've got from a while ago in different things and apply it to stuff now. So I'm going through the whole moving the source code from Collab to Git, and then from Git setting up build pipelines, so it automatically builds to different off different branches at different times, setting up Git flow, and then based on the different branches using the preprocessor directives so that it builds the different platforms, like multiple different VR headsets all in one build push to certain endpoints. And then there's flags for things like turning on analytics. So that's been keeping me busy on the work side. And then on a personal note, I'm kind of just, I've been watching the development of a game called Arcadian Rift. It's one of the many YouTube dev diaries for games. And it's very satisfying. It's a fun experience watching someone make this space game in Unreal. And so whenever I have a bit of free time, I've been opening Unity and just making spaceship levels and doors and turrets and security cameras and just stuff that I can do while doing other things to sort of entertain myself, you know.
Okay, so Arcadian Rift, I'm going to drop the link in chat. It looks like it's a shooter.
It's a first-person shooter where you loot spaceships and then you basically loot them for resources and things and kill robots and then upgrade your ship and then upgrade your weapons. So I've been watching the development of this game for about a year, and so it's getting to the point now that he's doing live streams with designing the levels live, and I love level design. I think if there's any content in game development that isn't covered enough, it's music, but after music, it's level design. And so I think those two topics are things where anytime I see anybody doing content that's about level design or about sound design, I'll watch all of it. And so it's very satisfying.
Yeah, I'm going to have to check that out. It looks beautiful. So I'm curious to see what the level design videos are like. And I guess maybe check out some more Unreal development. It's been a while since I looked at that. Is he using the latest Unreal version, or do you know what he was on?
I think so. Although one thing this is just a fun thing. So obviously a lot of people talk about how great the features in Unreal are, and they are. There's a lot of great features. But he's currently doing level blocking, and he's bought a third-party asset on the store it's quite cheap. It's like $20 or something. And it's for level blockouts. It basically lets you use these prefab blocks and extrude them out and make different shapes. And it's fine. It's pretty cool. But it just reminded me, man, Pro Builder's so much better. Like the tools we have for level blocking in Unity, like dwarf the stuff that you have in Unreal. So at least that's one very strong point of pride, that if I want to prototype stuff in Unity, like I can extrude faces, I can triangulate my meshes. I don't have to go to a 3D modeling tool to do relatively complex stuff. And UModeler is even more complicated than that. So you can get very far with the level tools.
Yeah, Pro Builder is the only way I can make a level, really. Pro Builder or some terrible terrain editing. Outside of that, I need a game designer. So.
And people forget there's polybrush too, right? So if you wanted to have something like a ship, and then you wanted to have the ship look like it's been attacked, you can literally take the mesh you've just made, the blocky one in Pro Builder, bring out polybrush, and just like paint, just like you would terrain, and deform the meshes and make it look like it's got craters and things in it. So people forget that you can actually do most of that process, and you can export it out as an FBX, and then customize the models and make it more performant, do your LODs. It doesn't just have to be blockouts. Like if you're using blockout tools, sometimes you have to just throw away the blockouts and replace it with real stuff later. But Pro Builder does a very good job of letting you, do UVs and manager meshes and actually just like upgrade them to real models rather than have to throw them away. And again, I'm not sponsored by Pro Builder.
Yeah.
I just think it's my favorite tool in Unity.
You're not
You
sponsored by Pro Builder?
You actually brought up the biggest thing about Unity's latest upgradable assets in the asset store, where they have literal models, prototypes built with Pro Builder that you have a prefab swapper for high resolution ones that you can buy.
Yeah, I've tried using those. To be honest, again, it's just like we said before about systems and stuff. I prefer just doing it myself. There's something very satisfying about putting some blocks down and just extruding out shapes. And as I think I showed Jason once, the way I tend to do this is invert the faces, right? So you basically build it like an outside shape of the rooms, flip the whole thing inside out. You now have outside walls and a nice inside space. And then if you want to add outside walls as well, you take the shape you just made, duplicate it, do an extrude faces so it doubles in size or adds a bit of extra thing, reflip it back, and you've now got double-sided faces for an inside and outside room. It's a whole thing, but like it's very quick. Like you can make an entire space station with multiple corridors and stairs and paths and stuff very, very quickly.
Yeah, you had an interesting technique for drawing out your levels and importing them in on a plane too. That I thought was pretty cool. Let's dive into that a little bit.
There's another one too. Yeah, there's the polybrush tool. You literally can like trace a drawing you've made, extrude out the shape, and then flip it inside out.
Yeah. Definitely cool. What about you, Andrew? What's new over there with Infinity PVR and all your live streams?
We've got a couple new characters that I've textured live, which was nice. It'll be a while before they get out in the wild, but a tree ant and a demon dog or zombie dog both work because it has both looks. But mostly I've been focusing on continuing with my modules, redoing those and redoing them better and learning some new things along the way, and not using some of those new things but using other new things, and just getting them closer to being re-released as a new version, and then getting back on track with Legend of the Stones, using that new version for handling all the data.
Nice.
Yeah, that's super neat to hear even more assets are coming out. I was actually taking a look at. It's really neat to hear even more assets are coming out. I was actually taking a look at your store page through the week, thinking about if I can use it for anything I've been trying with my needlessly complex project.
Nice. Yeah, it's always fun to get more characters and stuff out. It just takes us so long. I always feel so bad because I'll say we have a tree ant, and then it will be like a year before it actually comes out, or more. That we have a Hydra that's been a year and a half. We just haven't been able to get to it. It's a much more complicated character. It's got 5 heads, I think, and they can all be sliced off. And so there's animating that's going to be a challenge. And so we've been doing lower hanging fruit instead.
Yeah, that's a lot. If you allow them to slice the heads off, you have your version 1, no head slicing. That's cool though.
It's built in. They're just submeshes. But yeah,
the head just disappears. Done. He's programmer.
That's what particle effects are for.
To hide all the bad stuff. So I think we could probably start jumping into the code review. I wanted to quickly share the game though and see if everybody can see what it looks like. I have no idea if this is going to work. So I'm going to hit the button, see if I can actually share the window and have it show up here through Restream. Let's see. Oh, yep. It looks like it does work. So here's the actual game that we're going to take a look at the code for. See, it's a racing game. It's got my speed there, and there's a timer up top, and there are obstacles on the racetrack that if I hit, I'll lose complete control. You just kind of race around, get past checkpoints. Let me get to at least a checkpoint so that when we're looking at checkpoint code, it makes sense what we're talking about here. Keep racing through. Here, maybe I'll hit one of these obstacles. Did you guys get a chance to play? Oh, that's power up.
You sent us the folder of scripts, so I didn't have a project. I just had the scripts.
Oh, I didn't say. I thought I forwarded the whole email. It should have had both. There was a link.
It's a different link. Yeah, it was at the top of the email, but it's Mac. It doesn't work on a Mac yet, so I didn't get to try it.
Oh no! Well,
I know.
There's some context for you guys as well. Then apparently there were power ups too. I'd only hit bad things, so I didn't realize that there were good ones to hit too. There we go.
Yeah,
here, hit checkpoint. Bam,
that was a boot.
Checkpoint, got more time. Getting more things. Maybe there aren't bad ones, and I was just a terrible driver before. But I swear I thought I was hitting obstacles nonstop. But yeah, that's essentially the game. A racing game with checkpoints, and we've got the code, and now we're gonna, I guess, just dive into it.
It's procedurally generated, right? So it's endless.
Yeah.
The road never ends.
Supposedly, yeah, from the segments code.
Cool. So you guys all had a chance to take a look at it. Where did you want to start? Yori, Jason, Andrew, anybody have an idea of like the first thing that you wanted to call out with it, or just around the general structure? Or
I was thinking we can start with simple and just go alphabetically, because they actually start small and then get really big in the middle of the alphabet. Seemed nice.
Okay. Well, let's find my racer project so we can show the code here. We'll minimize all of the extra stuff and close all of the files. And then which one are we going to start?
Audio manager, I guess, to start there.
Sorry, what was that?
Well, I guess the first script we can look at is the checkpoints, because it's literally in the root folder of the scripts and it's relatively small.
So much for alphabetic then, because audio manager is technically the first one. But
audio doesn't get attention. We already talked about that.
Yeah, we've established that. Everyone
it's not in the root folder though. So this script has a few interesting points despite being so short. The first thing I wanted to point out is you have compare tag here, and that's actually something I don't see very commonly, because most people would compare a tag by saying tag equals another tag, but compare tag is actually faster. So that's good.
But this is a compliment for starters. Yes, just keep in mind that compare tag is the right answer. So that's just to highlight.
Yeah.
And so Writer will auto-complete it for you with the tag options, which is nice.
I think it will warn you if you're trying to do tag comparison without it. So that was nice, but using tags still kind of irks me, because I don't like the idea of reliance on a string that you can't have multiple versions of. Like, once you start using a tag system, you're locking yourself into this thing can only have one tag ever. And then if you need something that has two tags, you have to rewrite the entire system. Not a big fan of that part.
Also, especially because you're getting a player, my personal preference is literally have an interface or a script for player. Then you can just say get component, do things with it, and you've got infinite freedom there too, because you're talking to a contract rather than the implementation. The problem with using tag, in my opinion, is once you do the tag, you're like, cool, I've established it's a thing with this label, but it mightn't have any of the things on it that I need. At least if you're using an interface, you're expressly checking for the type of thing that you're using.
So I wanted to just chime in that I generally, for the most part, agree and don't like to just tag things and make things with tags. But since Unity has started making player like a default tag, and when there are games where there's only ever one player and it's relatively straightforward, and I know I'm not going to be loading up a bunch of other tags, I'm just going to have the one. This is something that I find myself doing as well. If I don't have another component for the player yet that makes sense to be the thing that I'm tracking. If there was like a car and I could track the car and use that as a get component call, fine. But when I'm starting out, a lot of the time I'll just kind of begin the same way and just tag it as the player until I figured out what that component is that this checkpoint should actually care about. And because I don't like to just I used to make a base like empty player script, but then I found that just kind of became a collecting point for junk that wasn't well organized. It would slowly start to creep into there. So I stopped doing that and just started using that tag as my placeholder until I had another option, or until I had a better alternative that made sense and was strongly typed, I guess.
And another thing too that I think I want to give credit to, because people get this wrong a lot too, is oftentimes people use what are called flag parameters or flag arguments, which are really a bad idea, where a lot of people might do something like set active and pass in true or false. Now, if we're talking about the single responsibility, or we're talking about different ways of having clean code, we've established methods should really only do one thing. And if you've got something called set active state, you're doing two things. You're by passing in a true or false, you're expressly implying an if statement. You're implying a branching code. And for something like this, you're probably going to do activate and deactivate. So I'm a big fan of this. Even some people might look at that and say it's arbitrary or unnecessary, but I'm a big fan of expressly separating your flag states. So checkpoints can be activated, they can be activated. Maybe you can check if they are activated. I might even put in a toggle function, which will internally do a check and then switch between one or the other. But I guess the point is, if these are actions that are doable on a thing, they should be on the thing and not flag based, from my perspective.
Yeah, I perfectly agree. There are two more points I wanted to point out, which is the compare tag actually uses a string literal, which I am not a fan of because it's prone to errors and if anything ever changes, etc., etc. So whenever you want to look for where is the player tag used, you suddenly have to look for the literal string, and the word player will appear in many different places. So it's not a
You've got case insensitive issues too, right? Like you might call it player lowercase p and get yourself into hot water with that. Some of the solutions I've seen done in the past are generating a class. You can literally say for each tag generated. I don't like that solution. I think it's unnecessary on top of everything else. But yeah, in general, avoid magic strings, as they're called.
Yeah, so that's another thing. The checkpoint event that we have at the top is static, but it doesn't actually pass which checkpoint we reached, which feels like a bit of a wasted opportunity. And also, while we have a deactivate method, we actually set active to false directly in the onTrigger enter, which I feel was a bit redundancy of the code.
Instead of
like
just
if you actually
deactivate there on 16.
Yeah.
Well, now, just to counterbalance this, I'd argue that realistically you're right. In this case, though, because there's not a virtual function, you're not overwriting it, and so it does exactly the same thing, but it's slightly faster to call it this way. If instead, though, it was a virtual function that could be overridden, you would want activate to fire in both cases. Then I would agree with you. But because in this case it's not virtual, it doesn't bother me too much.
Yeah. So I covered what. Yeah.
Yeah, one last one on line 8, actually. So if you're one, I just don't recommend static events like this anyway. I just think it's a bad idea to have a global static event like this.
It's funny, I like them.
Yeah, event trigger.
Each to their own, but yeah, it's either way. My point of those, if you are using events, it doesn't really apply here because of the context. But if you are using events like this, make sure to look at the event keyword. I'm sure they'll. I think I saw this elsewhere to bring up, but
there we go.
Yeah, you want to use the event keyword because that basically means you can't delete its contents. If you don't use the event keyword, you can set it directly to null and wipe everyone else's events. And someone trying to subscribe to an event shouldn't have the freedom to wipe everyone else's subscribed events by accident. So having the event keyword stops that from happening. It also means you have to invoke it from inside the class. If you don't use event, then you could literally say, grab any checkpoint and call invoke anywhere, which isn't conforming to the rules of what it's supposed to be doing.
Yeah, it doesn't look like that's happening here, but it is definitely a possibility. Yeah, you could just set equals instead of plus equals or minus equals and clear the whole thing out. So yeah, event keyword definitely there. So on the let's just real quickly talk about static events for when something just changes in a system. I know you don't necessarily like them, and to be honest, probably 5 years ago I would have argued against myself on this and said, no, they're probably a bad idea. You shouldn't do them. What's your reason for just not liking a generally, like, I assume it's just generally static events, or is it?
Yeah, because I look at it as there are ways to add the to kind of sidetrack a bit. It's like the concept of singletons. In general, singletons, without going into the whole big rant about that, the point is there are ways of making things singletons without making them singletons, if that makes sense. So anybody who does dependency inversion stuff knows that there's an entire way of marking an instance as a singleton. And my point is, if you're doing something like a global checkpoint, there are ways of making those using like some kind of manager that will subscribe, find all checkpoints, and register them and fire the events. You can effectively get back this behavior if you want it without expressly having to expose it as a first-class citizen.
It gets a lot more complicated though when you're adding these checkpoints at runtime, right? My understanding is that these are getting created at runtime.
But I imagine like one of the like a checkpoint, for example. I'm a big fan of code that supports change, and so there's nothing wrong with this code as is. But I try to foresee possible future paths, and one of them is checkpoints are one type of thing. But down the line, there's a very good chance there'll be checkpoints that are invisible or only apply to AI, or checkpoints that are things that do certain checkpoints that are applied for different time trial modes and things. And as it stands, there's no way for you to say, fire this event, but only in certain cases. Now, if it was instead a non-static one, and the objects, the checkpoints themselves, called checkpoint manager.register this, you could iterate those and subscribe to events if you wanted to, but you could also now do it by applying a filter and only subscribe to ones that are of type X, Y, or Z. The point is, you can never, from this point forward, limit which of those objects gets firing that event unless you start doing things like making virtual functions that then change when it's fired or whatever. I guess the point is, to unbind this is now harder than it would be if you didn't put it in and put something on top afterwards if you needed it. Again, it's a personal preference. I won't say it's a solid rule. I'm not saying I've never done static functions like this. But if I do have something like this, what I would do instead, my personal preference, is to take in some kind of handler, have a function called checkpoint event handler, and I would have some manager have all the checkpoints, and then it would have a static event, and it would iterate all of the checkpoints, register itself with them, and then fire the global event of the manager that a single checkpoint has been changed. Again, I know that's extra architecture and layers, but from my perspective, a checkpoint shouldn't fire a static event. Maybe a checkpoint manager could, but not a checkpoint individually, because it's an instanced element. It is not a static thing.
And you actually brought up a really good point earlier where things other than the player might try to touch this, and the game we already know has a ghost system. So is your ghost a player? Because if you just spawn another vehicle and try to make that follow different inputs to mimic an old run, it will have the player tag. So you now have to change the tag.
But that might be okay, right? Because then if they're going through in a replay mode or a ghost mode, they might want some other notification, something else registering for the checkpoint reach. You just wouldn't register for checkpoint reached in that mode.
No, I mean, in the case that you have another clone of the player instance, it will have the player tag if you're relying on tags. And then it might invoke the checkpoint.
I would imagine the developer would... Yeah, I would imagine they would change the tag. I mean, that's what I would do as someone who has utilized tags. You change the tag. However, I see the total point where really the checkpoint should be able to do different things depending on what is there. So if there's only one thing that happens when a checkpoint's reached, it means only the player can do a thing. But if there were saying like, oh, the ghost reached the checkpoint, maybe you want a different sort of action to happen to say that you're losing against the ghost or your friend or whatever it might be. So maybe you would want to separate that out so that different actions can happen depending on what goes through.
Then I would probably just make that a parameter.
Yeah, I was going to say, to be fair, a way to get rid of a lot of these issues that we're talking about would be if that was action of type checkpoint and you passed in invoke this, that gives you a bit more freedom because it means you can now filter on the returned response type. And if you want an example of that being done, if you do follow the standard, well, if you're passing in two things, you're getting into different territory. But the general point is that if you do fire an event like that, you can filter on it later, and it gives you a bit more freedom because you can literally choose what you're responding to. You know.
Yeah. But I still wouldn't add that until you actually have a choice to make.
Of course.
Like, if you're not actually doing anything with it, it's just extra complexity for no benefit. And the only... Go ahead.
I I was just going to say, this is also just generally the Microsoft standard, right? They use something called event handlers. And if you follow the standard convention, the first parameter of an event handler is always the object with which sent the event. You may not always need it, but it's a very simple standard to follow. I don't use it for everything, but if I have something that is a manager or something, I will always have the first parameter be the thing that sent the event so that the subscriber can basically query against that object for additional information if it needs to.
Tends to be super handy. Should we move on to another file, or you guys want to talk more about
We get a lot of mileage out of these 20 lines, so I think we should probably move on.
Okay.
Yeah. So the next one should be Drift Camera. It's also in the root folder.
Let me undo these to make sure I don't get rid of any errors. It was which camera?
Drift Camera.
Drift camera. Got it.
So this one already has a bit more going for it. We already covered some points, but others might be fun to talk about. First off, one thing that immediately caught my eye, there is update and fixed update, and they have a setting by which you choose where to update the camera. Now, this is something that you only see in an asset like Cinemachine, where you get to choose which update method you use. But when it's your own game and you're already authoring everything, I don't think you need such a setting because you're not giving this to the consumer afterwards. And it
seems
feels
more like
kind
an experimentation thing, trying to figure out how to get something right, toggling those options at runtime or something.
Yeah, I'd argue though that after you finish your experiment, you should remove this option to screw up every time you make a level that needs a drift camera.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. If you're not making something for a consumer, try not having a bazillion options that you can screw up yourself with. Next,
the next thing I just want to cover there on line 20. Now, this is just because I'm going to counteract what Jason's going to respond with here too, is that yes, this is fine in the size and scale of this project. It doesn't need to change, but I'm looking for points of contention in future, and line 20 will bite you in the ass later. As somebody who has on many occasions had to migrate a project from the normal quote unquote original input system to the new one, like how many people, we've all done this, how many people have downloaded an asset at some point and it uses a different input system than the one you're using, and all of the scripts are literally broken on arrival. You can't even test their sample scene because you're using old, they're using new, you're using new, they're using old. And so as a general rule, if there's a thing that does stuff and input that makes that thing do stuff, those two things are intrinsically separate. And so I will always, personal preference, maybe it's overkill, but I will always have any object that has input receive the output of the input, not the input itself. In this case, it's just a flag. If get down switch do thing, all of this can be replaced with just switch view. And if you had switch view, you could have something else saying camera input. Camera input can have just the one line of code. If input get down switch view, and if that code broke and I was somebody who'd used your code and wanted to implement it in my project, I can just go, oh, the input doesn't work. I can replace that file with one of my own, or I can delete it, and I have exactly where the inputs live. I don't have to, like in the case of, as much as I love Kinematic Character Controller, I don't have to go through their example scene and gut every single input dot reference across their bloody sample because they haven't supported the fact that I may be using the newer input system.
Yeah, personally, I'm just happy that the hotkey is a variable. That's enough for me generally. With most of I pretty much I've switched input systems on projects 2 times, and both times it wasn't very difficult. It took me, maybe a couple hours on a really big one and less than an hour on the other one. So I don't worry too much about it, but I hate having the keys be hard coded. So I like the fact that it's got a hotkey there. I do like the idea of abstracting away input, of course, but it's not as big a deal for me as it is for you. But I know you change inputs a lot more than I do too. Like I said, I've done it like twice, 2 times where I actually had to do it, where it wasn't just me screwing around. I assume that's
based on work stuff. No, based on work stuff, the amount of times I've had to pull down sample assets and packs and roll the dice about whether they chose a different input system than me, and it's like, cool. I had a 30-minute job I was about to do, but now I have to sit here for an hour as I have to figure out how to decouple their decisions of input because they didn't just give me a single layer to swap out in the case of someone else wanted to use a different input.
I have multiple emails going out to Asset Store assets makers that are saying, hey, you don't support the new input system. As soon as I imported your project, I always get errors for this, and that. You can use this ifdef to fix it. Here's what I did to fix it for myself. Because it got me stuck in multiple times, and it's really frustrating when it happens and you don't expect it to happen because you have all the motivation to just work on something new. If we want to move to another point here, there's quite a bit of cyclomatic complexity as we go down into.
Well, first, one thing that is positive, you're doing the right thing on line 41. So this is what's called a guard clause, and this is effectively saying, the example I've used before is it's like giving someone directions. So when you go through your method, it's ifs and else. It's like a journey, and you're saying, okay, first take the left, then if it is side view, take the right, and if it's this, so you're building a path. And every time you say 41, you return early. It's like not even taking the journey. It's considerably less complex to just not take the journey than it is to do this whole if this thing, else this thing, if this, whatever. So whenever possible, leave early.
And that's inside this update camera method. You're talking about the line 41 where they check to see if following is false and just exit right out of the method, right? That's the guard clause. Just clarifying for anybody who wasn't actually seeing the lines and just listening to your words. Make sure this. No, every time I say you've got update camera, check see if you're not following, and then just bails out, doesn't do the rest of the code, which is something. It's a habit that I have too. I like to use guard clauses just at the top. Check the state of stuff, make sure that everything's good, and then bail if we shouldn't run the code below instead of a big giant if statement with braces and a bunch of indentation.
So Jason covered what I wanted to bring up with a simple case of cyclomatic complexity goodness here. But if we're talking about implementation of things, at line 51, we have a case of vector3.lerp, which moves the point by which it wants to lerp forward. And that's reliant on your frames per second. So I just wanted to bring it up because that might be a point of failure if you're trying to run your game at vastly different speeds. This might actually take way longer or way shorter, depending on how you wrote your positions from start to finish.
Oh, and that's a good point too you bring up. Because this update camera is the code that's switching between late update, and the other ones, the value of that delta time and the rate at which that'll update will vary differently depending on if this function is called in fixed update versus update. So you have to be careful about when you are using those different functions. Keep in mind, fixed update is fundamentally designed for physics-based calculations, stuff that needs to be consistent rather than something that needs to be pulled faster. So in general, just be careful. If you're doing something that needs to be smooth, it'll be a lot less smooth in fixed update.
Yeah,
I
that's
wonder
actually
if this
one
is
of
actually running at late update time, since that's one of the options. I wonder what the actual option is that's checked in game.
It's actually one of the things I wanted to bring up immediately because one of the biggest mistakes I see people who begin using Unity come across is that they update their camera in fixed time and then they have no idea why does everything look laggy as their character interpolates smoothly as it moves. It can also go the other way, but sometimes too, when the camera moves smoothly, but the character only updates at fixed time, so the character lags behind a bit and looks jagged. So this is what you want to watch out for.
Another one too. This is just if you are like, again, we've established you probably shouldn't have these 3 update flags for what you're doing. If you are going to have them, and I know I've said before, even though I personally don't recommend using enums for non-static contexts, or for non-set lists. But in this case, if you are going to literally switch on 3 different unique flags where they're not like, for example, the subtext of what you've got here implies you could have 2 trues and a false, or 3 trues, or all false, but that's not really the case. These are meant to be 3 unique parts of a set. So that should be an enum of camera update something and then 3 fixed, late, and update. That way you're only ever assigning 1. Again, I don't actually recommend doing this at all, but if you are going to do it this way, you should discreetly highlight which version of the paths you're taking as unique kind of paths in that branch.
Something like this, but maybe with a better name than update time, so you don't end up with multiple true things, right? So you're not, I guess, unless somehow you want to update the camera in update, fixed update, and late update. But I assume you probably don't. Any number is an option. But again, my guess is that this is all just going to get deleted away. You know, who knows? It looks like there's just a hotkey to switch through them and then figure out which one works right.
Yeah. One more thing I wanted to bring up, if we go all the way to the start of the file, at lines 8 through 11, we have something that I didn't expect, which is public references to everything. And I see no reason why any of this should be public. This should be a serialized field that's private. And the other files already tell that the person knows how serialized field works, so it made me somewhat interested in why the decision here was public.
Why these ones don't match the other convention? It's a good question. I wonder, maybe they came from something else. Interesting. Yeah. But yeah, the general idea would be make it serialized.
Usually the answer to that is someone has copy and pasted code, and you end up getting mixed standards across different things. That's usually a sign of that happening. But either way, it's entirely fine. Like, you're perfectly okay with copy and pasted code. I do it all the time. Just once you have copied it, take a moment to refactor it in to match your style and what you're doing.
Yeah, generally right before you commit, and everybody else is going to see it, right? You're like, oh, I'm about to commit. Let's go look at the diff. Oh, this looks off.
Another thing, this is just a personal preference as well. On line 13, you've got value called float smoothing. Now, if you ever expose a float value in the inspector, at the time of writing it, you understand what valid values are. So 6 apparently is a perfectly valid value. But as someone who doesn't know what this script exactly would be doing, I don't know, should the value be 0.2? Should it be 5? Should it be 5,000? Like, what's a good number for this? And so because you know, give yourself a fairly wide but sensible range of values. And if you expose it as a range, it means that anybody, even yourself, coming back to this later, going, oh, what are my options for smoothing? You can just slide it and play with it. You don't have to worry about, what if I set it to 500? Because we've all been there where we've used someone else's script and gone, what even is a good value? They've left everything at zeros, and I don't even know if this should be 500, or 5,000. It's infuriating. So get into the habit of, whenever you have any value like this, set yourself a nice median value to start and give yourself a range of options.
I actually want to extend on this and say that the name smoothing is actually not describing what you are smoothing, and there are many options even in the drift camera. It could be the position, it could be the rotation, it could be both. If it matters, you might want to say what kind of thing you're smoothing in the name.
I was thinking
or give a tooltip.
And while we're at it, because we're gonna really dive in, speaking of standards and practices, yes, they're public, and so I presume the reason why it was done this way is publics do not use an underscore and privates do, which is a convention, but it's not the right convention. That's not what that's for. If you are using underscores like in line 16, that's meant to denote class scoped fields. And if you're doing that, all class scoped fields should be private and have an underscore. So in this instance, either have none of them have them or all of them have them. I prefer having them, and so all of these other things, advanced options, look at target, position target, side view, they should all have the underscores as well to be consistent.
I do want to bring up that this might actually be Rider's fault, because if you go to the settings for Unity in Rider, it decides that serialized fields should be camel case by default. If you're a Rider user, you need to change that manually so that it doesn't tell you this is the correct way. So we covered all I had for this class. If you want to move forward, we can.
Do a quick scroll down. I think that's everything.
That was pretty much all of it, right? You can switch between modes and update the camera. And then it lerps around, has a little bit of smoothing that gets multiplied by the delta time, and then it needs something to be a little bit more frame rate independent. But
oh, actually, here we go. Hit another one. Line 41.
Line 41.
Sorry, 46.
46.
Again,
where we set the position and the rotation. Hold on. Let me interject.
Okay.
So if you've ever talked to my buddy Jason Story, he's going to tell you about this awesome method in Unity to optimize when you set your position and rotation at the same time. If you're setting them in the same frame and you make two calls, you're actually wasting some performance. And Jason's going to tell me, because I love it because you tell me this all the time, and I actually started using it regularly now. Set position and rotation. There's a method that sets both of them, sets the position and rotation. And I mean, literally, I'm not kidding. You reminding me of this many, many times has made me actually start using it. I first learned about it at a Unite conference. It was that inside talk. They talked about it, how that was like one of the performance increases. I was like, wow, it really made a difference for you guys. And then I kind of ignored it and forgot about it. And then you've mentioned it so many times that it's now like my standard. So
I'll be honest, you gave me fright. I thought you were going to call me out and say, Jason's about to say this, but he's wrong. I've learned that it's actually...
it's actually much slower. No,
it will also come up in a random topic later.
It is a very good topic. Speaking of
actually,
setting, go ahead.
Just again, it's fun. It's amazing. You pause for long enough, there's going to be something to find. Here's another thing too. Now this gets into more nuanced things. Line 50 works technically in terms of what you're doing. It performs the function you're probably intending to do, which is just move that thing over to this thing, but do it slightly smoother than it would be if I assigned it manually. Now, I've gone on a big rant about this before, and I don't want to, because it's a whole different topic. lerp is short for interpolation, and the entire point of the interpolation function is to move from one thing to another and interpolate smoothly from a value. So without going into a whole big thing, my point is this is actually not the right tool for this job. This is anytime you use lerp and you use the same output variable as one of the two input variables, you are fundamentally using lerp wrong. And the way I can demonstrate this is the fact that because you're using time delta and these objects, weirdly enough, position will never, ever, under any circumstance, reach the target destination. It physically cannot reach the target destination because by the way you're doing it, it's moving from a position to a moving target over an interpolation. So in short, the point of lerp is to say, I have a start, I have an end, move a thing from start to end using 0 to 1 as like a slider between the two. And in this instance, it's not the right tool. There's a whole lot of other options of how you could approach this, but I guess my point is people do this all of the time and it drives me insane because it's fundamentally a misunderstanding of what vector3.lerp is trying to do.
But kind of works because the effect they get is still pretty close, though, right? Because you don't get exactly to the end point, but you get close enough, and you get a little bit of weirdness at the end. But my guess is that with the camera, they don't notice it, right?
Yeah, but that's the problem, though. Like it works until it doesn't. Once you get close to your target, and then it starts acting weird. That's not a good comfort. That shouldn't be a it works until it doesn't. It's like, well, yeah, but that's not the right answer. Like there are better tools to do this. So yeah.
I wonder if position target is basically always changing as well, so that the end effect is that you're just saying, well, I'll just move more closer, but it's always going to change anyway. So if but to your point, yes, it's going to break at some point when position target stops moving.
Yeah, so in general, like what you're actually saying here is move from me to this other thing. Don't use lerp. Because and also lerp is going to act differently depending on distance size too, depending on what you're doing. Like if it's a long distance versus a short distance, you can get into weird scenarios. So in general, if you're trying to move from start to finish, use something like smooth damp. There's something there called vector3.smooth and that will do very similar to what you're doing, but it will do it in a way which stays smooth for the duration and equally. But we're not going to get into like actually writing because there's too much to cover. But just long story short, don't use lerp like this. Look into other options. Smooth damp and just transform.translate are two options at your disposal.
That was another one. Go ahead. I think, or let me just send this to you, Yorai. On the moving stuff and setting position, I know that one of the things you had mentioned or brought up was options for how to move objects. Do you want to just briefly talk about that with this? Is that what you were going to jump into?
No, I was actually going to bring up a very fun story that shows why lerp can have issues.
We'll do that first. Let's hear the story.
Yeah.
By all means.
So in Terraria, we have a lot of pet minions that try to follow the player as they run around, and you can unlock them. Every single minion has like its own way of moving. Some of them are shared, but different parameters. One of those minions says, here's my target point. It's an offset from the player. Lerp me to that position every frame. And that gives you a very smooth movement, but it never reaches the exact position unless you account for like rounding errors and praying that the number lands on the right one. This is fine until we had a line of code that said, if the position equals target position, and it inconsistently hit it or never hit it, depending on when we were, because of those rounding errors. So be careful of lerp at very small intervals. If it doesn't matter to you, more power to you. Just know it exists. As for ways of moving, We have lerp, we have move towards, we have smooth dump, as Jason mentioned. We can also just delegate this to any other system, such as dotween. If you wanted the movement to be able to reach the target, you could just cache the starting position, and then you'll always have a consistent from start to end, and then count a percentage, accumulate the amount, and then you know that you'll eventually reach the target, which is something that might be helpful here, depending on where you set the position target, because I didn't actually see where this becomes the active thing.
I
You see
think
a lot of
that's following the car. I'm pretty sure that's following
Yeah.
something on the car that's a child of the car, and it's just moving except for the times when the car stopped.
Yeah, I'm just saying I don't see in the code where we switch from saying side view to position target to etc. I might have missed it, but
Oh, to switch between the side view.
yeah.
Oh, it's right here in the update. It checks to
Yeah.
see there's a hotkey, and then it switches views between the two targets.
Yeah,
Basically.
so one of them immediately like sets you to the position, but the other one lerps. You could cache the point from where you started to where you finished, and then it will immediately go there over a duration. Now, this won't be forever smooth, but you could do some transition there. Just saying it's an option.
It's just I think when it's in that position target mode, it's going to be always just moving, right? Because that's when it's following behind the car when they're driving and stuff. Anyway, it looks like the author of this code is here too. He showed up for chat and here, so maybe we'll have some answers to some questions that we come up with along the way.
Well, then I apologize in advance because we're going pretty hard, a lot harder than I thought we would. On basically going through everything.
So. To be fair, most of this is perfectly fine, and if it works, it works. I'm not gonna judge something that works and say you shouldn't do it this way. This is bad. If it works for you and it serves your purposes, more power to you.
Well, like jokes aside, if this was a code review in a project I was working on, I wouldn't. Most of this stuff I would like nod to or point at, but it's not a deal breaker. It's perfectly fine. Like again, none of this stuff is really an issue. It's just if we are actively talking about ways to improve it, we're going to highlight everything in detail. So.
Yeah, without a doubt. I thought overall, looking at it, it was pretty good code. So I didn't
like literally. I'll put it this way: the first time I made notes on this, and I wrote notes when I went through the scripts, I didn't mention half of this stuff. I was just, it's fine. Here's a couple of things that make it better, but it's only because we're actively going into this detail.
That's what happens when we get into a discussion on it. So what's the next file you guys want to take a look at?
Foliage Spawner, and this is going to be the first thing that has a lot to talk about.
Yeah,
really.
I had actual notes on this one. Good. This one's
okay. So this is referencing a GPU instancer that I don't have.
It's going to be okay. We're just going to look at the scope of this class and not the smaller details.
Take a look at the whole thing. Total of 75 lines.
So I just want to start by explaining what I think this class does initially, because this is important if you've never dealt with GPU instancing before. When you want to render a lot of things and Unity doesn't do that ideally for you, what you can say is, here are a lot of positions for the things I want to draw them. But you have to actually build those positions that you're going to give it. You have to do that usually by making an array of position, translation, rotation, and then feed it into the GPU. And after that, you're kind of okay. Nothing else will happen. So what this class does is it makes a foliage array, and then it feeds it into the GPU instancer, and I think then it finishes its job. But it does that as an enumerator, and it takes it over time because it's going to do a lot of raycasts, and those raycasts are going to hinder performance. So I like the elegance of most of this code, but there are a lot of details that I want to bring up to improve as we go. Jason, do you want to start with your notes?
Sure. I don't know if you even bother bringing up the notes or just read through it as we go, but yeah, where's my notes on this one?
Yeah, sure, that's okay.
The first one is just like the spawn foliage is just huge, like unnecessarily large, and the main thing to first note is if I was doing a refactor on this, one thing that is a big red flag for me is whenever you have a for loop with a bunch of stuff in it. Like, there is never a reason to have a for loop with a bunch of stuff. A for loop is doing bulk actions on something, and if you're doing that, you usually have a thing it's doing. For each blank, do an X. So what I would do in every single case, if there is a for loop, I would take all the contents of the for loop and I would give it a name, and it would do a thing. And then I would say, for each thing, do thing. So just that's just one thing. I will never have a for loop with more than like 2-3 lines in it.
Yeah, I think you shouldn't exclude I think you should exclude line 63 from the extraction, but otherwise full agreement. Because line 63 is actually part of the iteration, so it shouldn't live within the smaller method. But before we even get to this one, there's something I wanted to bring up, which was very interesting and in favor of the creation here. If you scroll up to the top of the file, you can leave the extraction, but the
no,
top
I
of the
just
file,
wanted to show what it looked like real quick, and then undo it after I typoed the name.
Okay, so in line 12, we have a serialized field private bool active equals true. And this is a hack. So what's going on here is I assumed the author wanted to say this script should not function if I make it false. But so one of the things that Unity components have by default, which we all know, is a component with lifecycle has a checkbox if it's enabled or not. And I was going, hey, why aren't you using this here? And then I realized he doesn't have lifecycle methods, so he doesn't have anything he can do to prevent the execution of this. And he made an active bool, and I started finding this in the other scripts. So this is a nice way to disable the behavior of something, but I would say calling it active is going to lead people into the mistake of thinking, oh, it's the enabled property, or not thinking about it too much, because active, enabled, game objects also have set active. So you might want to switch that to something.
That's actually overriding the name, isn't it?
No, it does not, because the default component one is enabled, not active.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, but it already shows that people are prone to think this in mistake and not figure out what's going wrong. So I would swap this to disabled or muted or whatever else common word you have for these kinds of disable behavior of this internal thing. And just to add to that, there's a bug here, because if you go down to where this active field is actually used, it only yield returns null, which delays the execution by 1 frame. It doesn't actually prevent the rest of the execution. So I didn't understand the point of this one at all until I realized, oh, it's probably a bug, and oh, it's probably a lifecycle thing.
Yes, it's probably meant to be more like that. Right, is the goal.
Yeah, if not active, yield break, but yeah. You could just say if not active, yield break, which will break the enumerator. Yeah.
Which comes back to the whole guard clause thing again, right? There's no reason to have a giant if statement when you can actively leave if it's not active.
Yeah.
What would be the difference between those two in practice? Between yield, return null, and break?
Yield return null says this iteration you yielded nothing, but the execution still goes on. If you yield a break, it says this execution, we're done. I'm breaking out of this routine. Do not continue traversing this.
So I wonder if it's meant to become active while this is still running. Like maybe this just always runs, like all the time.
No, because it only builds up the array of foliage points once, and then that's it.
Okay.
So, yeah.
I see. So once it's done, it's done. And at that point, you don't need to return null because it's never going to be started again. Is that?
Yeah, usually when you do yield return null in Unity context, it just means delay this action by 1 frame, which there are advantages to, especially if you're trying to make like a forced order of how scripts will bind to each other. And you know this script has to go at the end.
Oh, and a side note, this is one thing. It's a funny thing. If you're using yield return and you don't actually care, you can just return literally anything, right? So people don't realize it doesn't have to be yield return null. It can be yield return the word hello or 1 or 0 or 2. But don't do that, because you'll see often tutorials will yield return 0, and that'll basically be unnecessary amount of work and garbage, right? You actually just want to yield return null. But if you ever see someone use yield return 0, just yield return null instead.
Yeah, unless it's actually a code that something
It
else
actually needs to
consumes.
return. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the point about the actives. So another thing, some fields here at the top, if we go to the top of the file again. So some things have a serialized field, and some of these are components like the mesh collider, and you also have a prefab. Oh,
my window's messing up. Okay,
Yeah.
so which one?
So in line 13, you have a reference to a mesh collider, and in line 17, you have a reference to a GPU instance prefab. But then at line 26, you have a prefab manager get component for the GPU prefab manager. And I just found it a bit funny that you already bother to get some things a serialized field, but this one has to come explicitly from get component. I generally prefer to keep it one way or the other. You usually don't need get component unless you're getting something dynamically. So just wanted to bring that up.
Okay, and it looks like it's just kind of following with the required component pattern. So they're getting the ones that are just required to be on there instead of caching them as a serialized field and grabbing them in on validate. I assume that's where the decision was made, though, on the separation. So I can understand that at least, but yeah.
Yeah, but there is no point to this decision because unless you're actively adding the Foliage Spawner at runtime, which means you have no access to set any of these methods, any of these fields, then you can already set it in a serialized manner. And Unity has a blog post about how get component is less performant than just having a serialized field. So I just wanted to bring it up. It's a small thing, but be consistent about where you get your things from.
It's also just more complex, and this is again side note, personal preference from a philosophy of designing these kinds of things. Get component is basically saying use some internal magic and solve this problem for me, just like find object of type, and that's perfectly okay if it's your stuff and you know what you're doing. As a general rule, I try to avoid magic things doing magic stuff unless I'm literally hiding it somewhere deep down inside of the rest of the code base. For example, I will sometimes use transform.find child name if I have built the prefab and I have put all the things into place. And if you start messing with the prefab children, you've already gone beyond the scope of the expectations of what you're using it for. But in most cases, I will take all dependencies of a class and put them at the top, serialized fields, and I will literally give them a header and I will say dependencies. These things are things this thing needs to do its job, and you must provide them. And then I will create a prefab, which by default hooks everything up as is needed to be used. But yeah, so I would just say in general, I actually don't use get component pretty much for anything other than when the component attached has an interface that I'm getting, not the type itself.
It's funny. I find that I use get component calls like this probably more often than both of you, and a lot of it probably stems from my desire to not tab back into Unity and go assign something, to just continue writing the code and write, and then just have it work. The one, in general, though, I agree that serializing it out and just having like an on validate that's caching it is usually a good idea. There's one case where it can get weird, though, where I have run into scenarios, and I don't see it with this because I don't see you having multiple GPU instance prefab managers. But I have seen many cases where the serialized reference was supposed to be to a local object. It was supposed to be serialized reference to to another component on that object. But then designers or me or somebody else went around duplicating things, moving objects around, and fucked it up. And we ended up with references on one object to another object's components, and then caused lots of problems. So in those cases, I will go with, if that's the scenario where one could theoretically be referencing another one, I can see them side by side, and I know that this is going to happen. I'll definitely go with a just get component call that's happening, or an on validate that's happening all the time to make sure that it's forcing to get the local component. So that's the
and
only thing I would
actually,
watch out for.
that also brings up a good point, is if you are going to use the component type, with the addition of two things, one the try get component and the other the inline variables, if I was to use get component, I don't actually use get component, I use try get component. And my personal preference is to say var found equals try get component out var type. And that way I can cache a boolean to say exists. And now instead of null checks and updates or whatever, I check against a bool, which is considerably faster. And it means I can use the object without doing any null checks.
That doesn't account for if the object dies midway, but you shouldn't do that at runtime anyways.
Exactly. It shouldn't be runtime in the first place.
So one more thing, some more things in favor of the author here. Assert is not null is a nice thing to have, especially when you have an important target. I would say that if your script intends to run and assumes everything is assigned, you probably want to have an assert is not null on the prefab manager as well, just in case. You know, because of the required component, it probably should be there, but doesn't hurt. And all the other reference fields, like if you don't have a prefab. And if we go down, there's actually a very interesting case in favor of even more down to the end of spawn foliage. There is a very nice case here for matrices.toArray, which I don't see used often. So to explain why this is nice here, I kind of have to go through the entire method, but the short gist is it begins by making a list that supports up to an amount of foliage. Then it tries finding where it can actually place a foliage. Only some attempts are successful. It adds those points to the list. Eventually, it says, well, I only had, say, 300 out of 500 foliage points successfully added. Now make that an array and give that to the GPU, so I don't have missing points drawing unnecessary things. There.
There you go. Get the whole thing on there. It's a little small when it goes zoomed out this much, but yeah.
So I just wanted to say this is a neat usage that's actually practical for toArray.
On the description of this function here, I thought I'd bring up the comments. So we haven't really talked about comments too much, but I guess the question is, so if we look at this as a user consuming this code, why are the comments there? Well, the comments were put there presumably because either the creator doesn't think it's clear enough what it's doing, and so the comments are there to explain what it's doing, or in general, they are there to highlight the different sections of a function. Now, in both of those cases, they demonstrate you're only putting a comment if it's already not clear. Well, it should be clear. And two, if you have different sections in code, you have different methods. Like you by definition of putting a title over the top of it, you are saying this does a thing. And so you're now this does a thing, which does a thing, which does a thing. So personally, rather than having all the comments, if you're saying that the first few lines pick random position, I would have something return random. Or probably a better example would be things like check if the ground is not too steep for whatever. You would just have, check ground. And so if thing, check whatever else. So if you're going to name things, literally like make a method, give the name something that's sensible, and that way your code will read like its intent. Like at the end of the day, this whole thing could read like pick random spot, and then pick random spot could internally say if check ground do this, else do this, and you wouldn't have to have the details sort of exposed on how it's working. So just in general, if you ever find yourself about to write a comment, ask yourself if it's because this is a separate method, and if it is, literally make it a separate method.
Yeah, so you can combine these two into another if statement, or all of this into another if statement. Have it just be 3 lines saying pick a point.
And again,
check the
that
point,
could be guard clause too, right? Like you could flip that. You could move that to a method, flip 48 to be a guard clause, and all of a sudden it's now like exits early and then does the rest and so on.
Yeah.
I do want to bring up one more small thing with this entire piece of code, but you could flip everything to guard clauses and then change the delay to happen at the start of the loop instead of at the end. so that you know that even if you break out early, this skip of a frame will still happen when it needs to. And it will reduce how much nesting you have in the code and make it easier to read for everybody. Because it's
in short, this 60-line function or so, or what is it? I forget it is 40 line or something. This whole function could be about 20% of the lines, and it could be flat. It could be a literal single flat hierarchy. And again, nothing's wrong with what's there, but it could be done in such a way where it reads in a linear flat structure.
Yeah, and he mentions in here that he writes the comments first and then writes the code, which is a really common practice and something I've done before, where you say, if I'm not sure exactly how the code's going to work or exactly what I want to do, I'll write out kind of the flow in comments, just the couple steps of the things I want to accomplish, and then write the code to replace it just right underneath it or delete the code. Seems like he's just left it in there for us to make it easy.
I do that as well, and I'll leave it in there because I know I'll forget 3 months later.
I do have 2 more very small points, and they're really just nitpicks, but there's inconsistent usage of var and then the field types. One thing that caught my eye was the raycast hit after var origin.
That was me, though. The var origin was my refactor.
No, it's there in other spots in the code, too.
It was there, too. Okay.
Not just you. Yeah. So that's just a small thing, but be consistent if you do that, and there really isn't any point not to use var ever, unless you're declaring a new field and you need it to be of the explicit type.
Or you're just not sure what the type is. That's the other one. If you're just not sure what it is, looking at the variable, give that.
Yeah. And one small tiny bit of improvement you could have here is you could force a seed at the start of this random polling, just so you know you can replicate an issue if it ever happens. Because right now it goes through an actual random and never lets you know, hey, this kind of configuration went nicely or this configuration went horribly wrong. What's going on here? You can't ever replicate the situation because you're calling random.range without setting the seed. And
recommending setting the seed either here, or would you do it as a serialized field?
So it's a bit of a trap because you have to set it every frame that you're going through this method. So what I would do is I would set it before the for loop starts, and then before every frame skip, I would cache it and set it back as soon as I'm starting to iterate again.
Okay. Got it. That is something I very rarely play with. But I'm sure you do a ton with random seeds, right? I mean, you must, Terraria.
Yeah. It's really nice to have the ability to replicate a situation that goes either horribly wrong or horribly right. There are times where like, oh, this seed is nice, we should do more of this. And then you check what kind of configuration that seed produced.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than when you write a test script and you have the randomizer called in like a validate function or something, and you're dragging something along and it's randomizing the whole time, and you're like, oh wait, I wanted that one. Oh well, it's gone forever. Can't have that back. It's very frustrating. On the concept of scaling for that scope, again, I wouldn't do it in this case because it's not needed, but it's just a thing that I would do as this scales, is the raycast line. So this is a foliage spawner, so it spawns foliage, which is perfectly fine, but one of the most common things you're likely to do at some point is choose, I don't want foliage spawned on top of buildings or on other rocks or on other trees or whatever other raycast hit surfaces you're using. And so right now, there's no real way to define the layers with which Raycast are hitting against. And so to me, Raycast is a very, very clear point of extension for future stuff. So what I do, probably overkill for a lot of people, I will always make myself what's called a Raycaster. And a Raycaster is just a thing that internally does a Raycast. And so I say Raycaster.check, and I pass in array, and I say if Raycaster hits something, I get back the Raycast hit and I do stuff. And all that means is I can now pass in different Raycasters. Raycasters against every surface, Raycasters against only gravel, Raycast against only grass. And I don't have to rewrite this code to support infinite numbers of potential changes of distances and heights and lengths and surfaces and whatever.
And if you actually want to go even one step further, you can decide that the way you get the points to add to this matrix are not even for a raycast. You could just say, give me a point to add to this. and you could immediately discard all the points that are not good, etc., within whatever point giver you make.
Which has another advantage of removing the randomness too, because you're not bound to either randomness or raycasts. A spawner should theoretically receive a point to spawn at, and it should be standalone from both things that pick randomness and things that do raycast. But again, we're not building an API here. We're building a thing that does something. None of these things are necessary in this case. But when you're looking at things that will change, just at least keep them in mind. And these are areas that fundamentally are the most brittle from a code perspective.
One light change that you can make, though, is just switching to the Raycast non-alloc. Right?
The non-alloc,
running at a runtime, and you could just stop allocating memory for these Raycasts. It seems like a one quick win. I'm pretty sure that this is running at runtime, right? From what I was looking at the code, it looks like it's generating. There's a context menu option, and then also as you're playing, and the world's generating. So not allocating.
So this
is a good easy one.
Yeah, this generates with every chunk that you go forward, as far as I understand. And also, while it's limited to 500 per frame and also limited to just once and then it's done, it's still nice to not ever allocate memory, because those things line up and they will make your point of garbage allocation farther across between lag frames. So I covered everything I had for this class. Do you have anything that you want to bring up?
I've got nothing else here. I don't know. Andrew, what do you got? The art is terrible.
I got the art looks amazing. I like the colors. I like the background. No, I got nothing because everything made sense. I don't know anything about this matrix stuff, and that confuses me, guys. I'm just ignoring that. But yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say matrices are far less intimidating once you just understand their fancy way of saying this is a position, rotation, and scale all at once. Literally all it is.
Yeah. When
Until you start
like
trying
that,
to multiply and divide them, in which case now you have to start doing some fun, wacky stuff with grids of numbers, and then it starts to get a little less.
It's just the space they're in. Okay, I guess it's also the space with which they're within, but yeah.
I think
to play devil's advocate for beginners, if someone says XYZ, I get it. XYZW? What's the W? No, I can, you can't just explain. It's not just it's the wobbly. You can't. There's nothing you could point at and say that's the W, which is what makes it confusing.
So the W is literally just, is it relative to me? Is it relative to the world? Because my forward cannot be the world's forward if I spin. So that's just it. Just like you can say X is left or right, you say W is me or world. It's that simple.
Should you bother explaining gimbal lock, or is that out of scope for this conversation?
Yeah, matrix programming is not the topic of this talk.
It's very hard to visualize with code too. We need some better graphics.
If we want to go forward to the next script, it would be the game data script.
All right, let's pull this one up.
So this one has, it has almost no execution, but where the execution is something that we can talk about extensively, probably. So one trap that is already visible here immediately is the properties invoke an event when you set them. And some properties will set other properties. Now, one thing I absolutely hate with properties is that when they execute code that can extend to calling other code, which means you suddenly, just by setting this one number, you suddenly kicked off a chain reaction of 500 scripts updating. And
the general name for that. No, the name for that's called side effects. And so as a rule, you want your code to not have side effects. Now, in the case of setters, I'm a little bit more lenient, because if you set something, you expect things to happen. Obviously, there's a limit to how much random recursive stuff that's going to do. But just as a side note, if you are using properties, your get function should never, under any circumstances, change the state of the internal thing. If you're calling get through a property, do not, now again, it's not happening here, but I'm just being very hyper clear about that. the entire point of get is a read-only operation. It's the difference between it's called command query separation, and queries should not change the state of the system. That's why I'm not a big fan of things which have like get ID, which internally actually increments the ID counter and stuff and gets into weird territories.
What do you think about random.value?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, exactly. I would only do that in the case where I literally build a randomizer class and it has a like dot random name, in which case you expect every call to be a random name. I would still probably prefer a randomized function, but whatever. I'll let that one pass.
I mean, that's why the C# version of random only has methods like get next instead of value. I understand the simplicity of it though. It's very nice for beginners to just have random.value, random.value in sphere, etc. So we talked about the property setting and the hidden cost of them, but there is one more property if we go down to the file once. So if you go to the player name and the personal best, they actually go through player prefs. And as we discussed,
funny enough, that's literally my only note on this class. My own notes is player prefs !
So, two things about this. First, they don't belong to this class instance. I don't see anything that is actually state set in here for the class. And I'm not a fan of an implementation that calls playerprefs.save every time you set a value. It feels like it will bite you later on. Because it's a write operation to disk too, and it can cascade depending on how much data you're saving.
Yeah,
it looks like it only happens when the game ends. It's a one-time call when the game ends. It should probably be like a set player name method instead of a property.
But even if that is true, if it is end of game, then directly one after another, presumably you're setting the name and setting the best, at which case you're calling save twice in sequence unnecessarily, right? So even if that is the case, the point of this code should be it should do a load of stuff and then save it. So this is out of scope for this particular conversation too, but the way I tend to handle this is the concept of a model and a view model. And what you're doing is you're setting a bunch of values, and you usually have a Boolean flag on the object. So rather than saving the player prefs, you have a Boolean flag called is dirty or has changed or something. And those objects will be set values, and then they'll have the has changed as true. And then when the time comes at the end of the game to save, you could say, take the player settings, if has changed, save them. That way you never have to actually perform any file system operations in the event the values have never changed from their originals.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, just try and lower down the amount of saves. And I actually would just go with a transactional pattern here and say set player and score, because it feels like it's something that would go for.
So these are happening at different times, just to be clear. Looking through it here, the name is happening whenever they change their name on the input field there, and then the score thing happens if they beat their previous high score. So they're not actually getting called right at the game over. They're just both happen to be in the game over screen file. It was a little bit confusing. It made it seem like it's kind of at the same event, but it's at different times in that life cycle. That said, though, I also just not a fan of having properties that do stuff in general. I mean, I think that having properties that are writing things. Where is that file? Game data. Having properties that are doing things in the setters beyond very simple validation, it always leads to a mess. And it's something that it's a trap that I say I fell into when I got really heavy into web and enterprise development, where I started using property change notifications. And then I was like, well, I can add a little bit more, start adding it in for these other libraries. And then I was like, well, I can start doing this in my games. And then you realize quickly that I assumed exactly what you were saying when I had to step away for a second, that it leads into this cascading mess of you can't tell what the hell's going on and all kinds of things are firing and stuff breaks quickly. I assume that's been your experience too.
I didn't get to experience this, but I've seen it, and I said never again.
I will say I agree with all of that, and I agree most people shouldn't. But I will also, to counteract my own statements, I do, for data like this, use I notify property changed, because as a pattern, it is extremely powerful if you keep to a standards, which is the data is only ever subscribed to by the thing that holds it, and then that is basically managed as it fires events onwards, so that you don't have the data randomly doing weird stuff. But if I was going to have events like in this example, where you have the score changed, if I was doing that, I would say this is game data. I'm obviously going to have other data at some stage. I would rather than having bespoke events for each one that needs to be written, event, invoked, handled, I would just accept the fact that game data is a thing that changes and evokes events, and therefore should use iNotify property changed. But that's personal preference.
I mean, that's fair, and you also get to see that it's an invoke property change as you work with it. So it's a warning, and if nothing else, because right now you get no warning of, hey, this field will kick off 500 things. I do want to stress out, though, the player prefs thing should probably either be made static or moved out to someplace else that you know it's not as simple as getting it from a file or etc.
Well, it
And you
seems
can
that
also
most of the saving is done with PlayFab, actually. And they're just keeping these two fields locally, and from what I saw, it seemed like everything else was on PlayFab.
Yeah, but I mean, personal best should be something that you save into PlayFab so you don't lose it as you use different machines. You could say external data provider and just let those properties get it from the external data provider.
The way I would do
Never
it,
have to worry
probably
about where.
the simplest version, I think, is to have a load and a save function on the object, and it takes in some object, and that object lets you say, get personal best, get player name. And then that thing could be a player prefs provider, or it could be a playfab provider, or whatever. And so this object would actually have no logic to do anything to do with saving or loading or knowing about any of that data. You would say at start of game, call gamedata.load and pass in the player prefs thing. And the player prefs thing would have all of the information to say, get me these values. And that way, this script would never change regardless of how many properties you'd want to add into the data provider. And if you swapped out to different providers, this code wouldn't change either. So I guess the point is, player prefs is an implementation of the concept of persistence for game data. So it is a specific implementation, or to put it another way, it is a service you're using. And in general, you don't want things to internally know what services they are using. You want somebody to hand them a service and they use that service to do a job, and then they can possibly give it back. That way, the work you do is with a service, not using it. For example, what we talked about before, Andrew, on your stream, I had this tree that draws nodes, and I pass it a thing, and I say, do stuff with nodes. And it's like, oh, or drawing, for example. I'm debug drawing in the scene. If I pass a drawer into a shape, and the shape is a line, it'll draw 2 points and a line. If that shape happens to be a sphere, it'll draw a sphere, because I've given it a tool that knows how to draw things, and the thing itself knows how to draw itself using a stacked combination of lines and points and whatever. So I never have to expressly tell it what it's using to draw. I say, here is a thing that draws lines and points. You want to draw yourself as a cube? Go for it. Draw the points and draw the lines. I'll figure out what that means later. That's not your job. That's my job externally.
I don't know where to go from there.
So for the next file, we can go for game manager, which
Let's take a look
is
at that.
going to be a loaded class. Jason, I assume you have notes for this one?
Yeah. Well, the first one, of course, is still the inconsistency with the differences between private underscores and stuff. That was the first thing that I pointed out. Second was the repeat of what I said before about range attributes in terms of the numbers of values and having different provided defaults. But if we skip those and move on to the other stuff, there's obviously the big bad wolf here, which I imagine you have as front and center is the find object of type. So I'll let you take it away.
So find object of type, and I want to say it's even worse when you look at the top and see that there are still serious field references to some components. So why are some getting the references through find object of type, even if it's on a different thing or made from different scenes, I would accept this, but I don't know because I don't have the project. So why are you looking for them all random instead of just serialized referencing them?
And here's the thing: if you ever find yourself about to write find object of type, a singleton is better. A singleton's not good, but in every case you're about to use find object of type, a singleton is better than that. So if you have to use some hack version of I need a reference to this thing, just go to the class, make a public static instance, set it to this, and use that. I don't think you should do that, but if you are going to choose between the two, always favor the singleton because it's the difference between searching every single object in your entire hierarchy tree or just getting a thing. Just there it is. Just give it the thing. It's a huge difference in terms of the amount of work it's doing.
So some more things here. There is only one assert of is not null, and I don't understand why. Just this specific thing is special and deserves the is not null. Because you're going to need all these references. You don't check if they're there or not. You're just using them. If score display is null, set score display for find object of type also took me off guard because it is a serialized field. So the only way I can see this one happening is if your score display comes from a different scene, but this only gets called in a wake, which means the thing that holds the game manager would have to spawn after the score display, which makes no sense to me at all.
Or if you're swapping out the score display, maybe working on a new one and trying to swap in a new version of it. The only other thing I could think of, and then added that in because it wasn't getting set.
I mean, it's a serialized field, so you can set it whenever you want. It's just an extra task, which find object of type is the only thing it solves is the task of assigning it when it's a different object, and you don't care to find it.
Maybe it used to be a single one, and then it got switched to a serialized field so that it could swap in two different ones to see different scores. Only thing I could think of, but
is it
like
possible?
It would fit in the non-validate better though.
Yeah, is it possible that maybe it gets removed like between scene loads or something, and so it just always needs to check it again at the beginning?
Something like that could be happening.
Again, you'd have, because this happens in a wake, it means it happens as soon as the object is loaded in. So this scene holder would have to happen after the score display is already available, even if you have multiple ones. So it's going to be a really weird festival of figuring out why your code bugs out because you changed the order of scene loading or anything else. Not recommended in any shape or form. Also,
a couple more things on that first. Is on 45 with score display. Now, it's a much bigger scope to talk about the relationships between objects here, and it starts to get a bit heavier. But I will just say, from a direction of dependencies, what's more likely, that you have a game manager with a display or displays with multiple displays at one game manager or multiple game managers at one display? And whenever you write something like that, where you're saying get component display, you're intrinsically saying there is one display for this game manager. And so as a rule, avoid that concept, because if anything's likely to change here, the display, there'll be multiple things that might want to display the manager. So you probably don't even want a reference to a display type in the game manager. The game manager should have an exposed data and access to data, and a display should get a game manager and do stuff with it. Now, not directly, if we want to get into the whole territory of splitting up between your presentation layer and whatever, that's a whole different conversation. But just in general, UI logic should stand separately from the game manager stuff as a general rule. And if you do have to tie them together such as the data doesn't know about the UI. You don't want to have the data object actually have to reference what it's displaying. It's the difference between writing a text label or something in an object versus having a text label get data to display on itself.
Looking through, so it seems that it's using the game manager to register to update the score UI essentially off of GameDev, and that should probably just be a separate class.
Yeah. One thing I did want to bring up, which, as a funny note, is there's something here that's brought to you by the redundant department of redundancy department. Private ghost system dot ghost system underscore ghost system. Kind of made me chuckle.
It's not just redundant. I find it actually like this gets into dangerous territory because stuff will start to mess up on you when you're trying to reference things. as a general rule, do not name things the same as their enclosing types. Just don't ever do it. If you don't have anything where it's thing.thing.thing with the same names, because what's going to happen is your IntelliSense is going to mess up on you, and you'll get into this really confusing territory where you're trying to create an instance and it's going, oh, that's a namespace, or it won't know what you're doing. So you're just better off always having them be different.
And there you're talking about the namespace and the class name, not necessarily the instance name, right?
Oh, sorry, yeah. For that, that's fine because that's just the named instance of that thing. But yes, classes and namespaces, or if sometimes it can be a bit weird if you have a class and you have a property accessor that's also called the same thing. That gets a bit weird too. And this is a whole separate note too. If you want a quick way to solve these kinds of problems, the namespace can be ghost system, but the class can just be ghost. The word system is giving you nothing here. It's not adding any value to what you're talking about. In general, we call these things noise words. If you go through your code and look at each word individually, ask, like, whole tangent, why do we name things? We name things to explain what they're doing or what they are. That's the entire point of naming them. If we weren't trying to explain what they were doing, we would just call them single letters. It'd be much easier to type much faster. So if we're going to use names, the entire reason we're doing it is because they matter. They're important. They imply something. And if I was to ask you, what extra information does the word system give you on the ghost system here, the answer is none, because you could call it ghost system, ghost manager, ghost handler, ghost controller, and in the context of what you've got here, none of these words have a special context. Now, controller does in games for different reasons, but the point is the word system is a completely nebulous, doesn't do anything word in most cases. So in this particular instance, yes, the whole thing can be a ghost system, but this is just the ghost that you are making, right?
Yeah, it almost feels like it should just be ghost records, right, or something like that. So it just has a thing to get ghosts or get ghost records and save.
Yeah, but to answer to what you say, Falco, like, what is a system? What are the intrinsic traits of a system? And if I put 10 things in front of you, which ones are systems? Is the game manager a system? Because it's managing stuff. It's a system that manages stuff. Is the input system a system? Is the game data a system, really? Or what about the terrain generator? Isn't it a terrain generating system? Shouldn't that be a system too? Like, where does
What about
this
the
stop?
Rift camera? Yeah.
No, I mean, I can see. So one of the reasons I could see adding in one of those words though is if you put in just the word ghost, I'm gonna visualize a character model of a ghost moving around and that it being the actual instance of it. But I think that,
well, to be accurate, I would call it Ghost Racer. I would have it. It is. I am a racer, and there's a Ghost Racer, and I would. That's
but
what I would
those
do.
are this is really a thing that stores and plays and replays and records and stops recording. Okay. Maybe it's a ghost replayer. I don't know. So what else have we got on here? Aside from the naming there.
So I didn't have a lot in this class aside fixed update has something that doesn't feel like it's warranted within fixed update, which is it's saying if you're exiting a segment, check the world position and end a new segment and then reset the exiting segment flag. Now, this is fine until you look at where is the assignment of exiting segment is, which is straight at the bottom. There is an on exit segment. And this leads me to believe that fixed update is completely unnecessary and you can just straight up put the code that you had there within on exiting segment, just add a new segment. And then you save yourself from empty fixed update calls every frame, which they can stack up in scripts that are instanced more than once. But still, it's going to be cleaner and faster.
So just to follow this along, by the way, I think that score change is going to happen in the physics loop too. It's happening in on trigger update. So all of this is going through on a trigger enter, or is it a trigger exit, right?
Actually,
this happens when the score increases, it calls through to that and sets that flag. I'm just kind of following that loop of that property real quick. The score change is calling in, going into the firing the on score change here. Oh wait, where was it? I just lost it.
Well, we're already getting into the trenches of this event.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, but you're saying essentially we could just get rid of fixed update and just have this be in an update instead. Let's find the fixed update again.
But yeah, just another thing on that note, actually, too. So
Just taking the entire thing here and just putting it there because you don't know if it's racing or not. So that's just a tiny thing to call to.
Now, is there any reason that the next segment method would need to be in a fixed update?
No, and even if it were, you could just make a coroutine instead, and there you got the delay if you need it. You don't even know when you exit a segment and when the next fixed update is called. So you could just say coroutine begin, wait until fixed update, call this code, and end. You don't need fixed update to be called everything.
Good catch. Did you have something else there, Jason?
I did, yes. There's a general concept here of what's called feature envy, and it's here in multiple locations, so we're going to go over it in a few different places. The first one is on line 89. Never do this. This is something we've already discussed. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong one. I was on the game manager. Yeah,
my lines might be a little bit off from.
You can break. Okay, so go
start
replay. Yeah, start replay.
There we go.
There you go. Yeah, there you go. So this, never ever do this. This is what we talked about before. A ghost system apparently has an event called start replay and has an event called start recorded. And what you are doing is, even though it has events that it does at certain times, you are reaching right into the guts of the system and invoking its event for it. You should never ever fire something else's event. The point of an event is a thing fires an event when it does something. And that is a symptom of the event keyword. The fact that you're not using the event keyword means you're allowed to do that. You should never, ever do that. So if you mark these as events and pop back over to the game manager, it's going to tell you, you can't do that. It is my event. You cannot fire my event. And if you want the Go system to start a replay, you should have to call a function to start a replay. And it may internally fire an event if it chooses to, but it's not your job to decide what events it fires.
Yeah. And you can actually see that the entire class up to this point kind of follows it properly, like audio manager start music player or checkpoint stopwatch start, etc. Even if it's not an event, it's just a matter of not having feature envy.
And I was going to say, from a credit perspective, the naming conventions on the events are perfect. It's exactly what I do, which is people often make the mistake of putting the on with the event declaration. You don't. It is start record, and then the subscribers are on start record. But that's a separate thing. So that's one. And then the other one is the same thing, but for line 85. You've got a vehicle, it has a game object, and you are setting that game object true or false. You don't know that setting a game object is how you turn a vehicle on. Maybe turning a vehicle on runs an animation where it pops into place, or it runs a between something. Do not reach into an object, grab its game object, and turn it on. If you want a vehicle to turn on, call vehicle.turnOn. It internally could just be game object set active, but in general, try to avoid any case where you're reaching into something else, taking its parts out, and then acting on those parts.
There's probably a method in here. Yeah, I bet reset vehicle. It's kind of or something similar that already does something similar to that. Oh no, maybe there isn't. There's essentially you'd add in a method on the motorized vehicle to turn the player on.
Mm-hmm. I would just say, I do this. I make something called actors, and actors have turn on, turn off, show, and hide. And that way, I don't care whether it's a character, whether it's a car, whether it's a signpost, whether it's a tree. If it's a thing that can appear, disappear, show, hide, turn off, turn on, I make that an exposed feature set. That way, the thing itself can have an animation that runs when it shows, or it not, and it's not my job to decide that. It's just, I want this thing to be appearing now. I want this thing to not be there. And the general implication is off and on immediately disables it, on or off, and then show and hide might do a flourish of some kind to show or hide it. So in general, I just follow that convention with every single thing that needs to show or needs to hide.
Oh, okay. What else you got?
So this is one other big topic, but the hard-coded strings for states in the toggle state method here.
Okay.
So,
now, does this do anything more than just set text, though?
So it says UI state machine change state, which I did not look into yet. But the point is, if you have states, they should not be representable with something you can mistake, because you don't know where they're created, you don't know the internals of what state would be supported. If you typo, what happens? If you change the name of the state, what happens? It's error prone, and you don't want things to be error prone.
Now, I'm not sure where this UI state machine is either, though. It looks like it's another package. So,
And I would also say, as a side note on this is one that might be a contentious point, but a state machine falls right into that category we just described of feature envy. It is the state, your internal state of whether you are hungry or sad or happy or whatever. You never expose the internal state. You can expose the output. You could have a character that's crying. It's a visual indication that its state is different, but you should never be able to say thing.statemachine.set something. So I actually, in every case, if a thing has a state machine, you never know it. You will never know an object that I make has a state machine. It might have a state machine, but if it does, that's an internal way where it mitigates between its different states. You will always access it by saying, become happy or do X or eat food, and then the states will change. You will never be setting the states on an object.
and here you're talking about the calls to toggle state primarily, right?
I just mean in general, anytime you have a state machine, you should never see it outside of the thing itself, like the events.
Well, here that's what I'm saying. I don't think you are seeing it outside of this thing, even though it's public. You're not actually seeing.
No, but at the very top, it's a field. It's a serialized field allowing access to thing.statemachine. You could reference this game manager from the top.
Where did you see that?
Oh, yes, here we go. It's serialized field. Oh, it's in the inspector. Never mind. I thought it was public.
It's just a serialized field in the inspector of some asset for a UI, it looks like. That's
okay,
probably, my guess is it's switching up that UI element and just doing some state stuff that they didn't actually code for the UI part and just switching between those. But I'm not sure what package that is. Let's see. There's a missing using statement. Pixel placement. So whatever pixel placement is, it's their state machine.
Yeah, but even if it weren't pixel statement or a specialized state machine, it's just a state machine. It sets states. And what we're trying to prevent here is setting an invalid state, because we're allowed to set whatever state we want. And the way we do it is by a string that may not indicate any specific state.
And even separately from setting state, if you query states, you have a lot of knowledge about how a system works. And if you expose that, you're basically saying, if I have thing.statemachine, even if it's just exposing the states, I now know that it works via state machines, and I'll be querying it as such. And if I wanted to have a version of something which doesn't use a state machine or uses a behavior tree or uses some other thing, I can't do that. So in general, I don't like to expose the fact that a state machine is involved outside of a thing itself.
So pixel placement is iTween. I didn't realize that. So I think it might just be a tweening library state machine that it's actually referencing there.
Gotcha.
That's what that is. I had to look at it. I had to search for pixel placement, and I didn't realize I haven't used iTween since the first
I
iPhone app.
a long time ago. Yeah, it's been a while.
The Unity supported versions 5.6.7 or higher. I think that's around the last time I used iTween. Actually, it was before 5.6. It was been like 4 something. So okay, that makes a little more sense on what it is, though, too.
So another thing, this is entirely small and unimportant, but it's just something to point out. Online, what's 30 for me? The stopwatch, effectively.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Now this is fine. There's nothing wrong with instantiating objects outside of the normal loop, but the way I would look at this is you are saying this thing needs to exist, and the way the code's going to work is effectively it runs through it once, does your initializers, and then does your constructors or your whatever afterwards. As a rule, to manage these things, if something has construction that needs to be done, like to construct a stopwatch or to initialize or to whatever the initialize function of your object is, should be where all non-value types should be initialized. So I just, as a rule, don't use reference type instantiation inside the class scope. That's a lot of fancy words to say, if you're going to set something equals new, do it either in a constructor or do it in the awake function. Try to avoid these random things newing up, because you have a lot less control over when things get created that way. And you'll get into this weird territory of stuff being created at the wrong times and memory stuff. You're better off saying from a lazy loading perspective. For example, you might want to have this object not load until a certain point and then start loading. If you put it here, just the act of having this script here will instantiate that object, even though you're not actually going to use it until a later time where you initialize it. So whenever you write new, keep those in await.
And it gets even worse if the constructor itself calls other things, such as external systems that it wants to pull data from, because there are loaded classes from APIs that go, oh, you initialize this system, here, let me go grab some information from another file, and then every time you create a new object here, you're actually doing a file access, and et cetera, and you don't get to see that cost. And it's even worse when it's not within the construction method, because it's harder to debug. Yeah. Especially if it errors, by the way. Just the mere act of new thing will cause you an error, and it won't point to the constructor. It will instead point to the new statement.
Yeah. That said, if you move it, you're not going to be able to use the read-only keyword there anymore. Right there.
If it's a constructor, you're allowed to set things there for the read-only.
Well, I mean, if they move it into the awake, sorry, they won't be able to.
Yeah, that's because Unity doesn't give you,
So here's another one, and again, we're really getting into like the weeds of nitpicking stuff at this stage, because there's nothing wrong with this. It's just the way I like doing it. On line 112 for me, under check world position.
Okay.
So, this is, I'm actually curious because you guys might disagree with me on this one. Whenever again, we've already established I'm not a fan of feature envy, so player vehicle dot transform dot position. It may seem arbitrary if I say that I actually expose a vector3 property called player vehicle dot position. I don't actually expose the reference to the transform. The reason I do this, though, it isn't just some stylistic avoidance or conforming to the rules. There's a very practical reason, which is I've done teleport systems before where you have to move an object to a position. And even though your target position is I want this thing to move to this vector, the pivot point may be optional, different, moved, or there might be some raycasting or something that needs to be done separately from setting the position to ground an object correctly. So in general, if you want to set a thing's position to a different position, I don't do it via the transform. I tell the object, you have been requested to go to this position. And internally, that object can decide, hang on a second, actually, that doesn't make sense for me because I'm a character controller and I need to check if I collide with it and so on and so on. So just in general, if there's stuff you want to do with position setting, again, give that to the object. Tell the vehicle, go to X, place at Y, and let that stuff be internal.
And I actually want to follow up on this because this is literally something that Unity already asks you to do when you work with rigid bodies. There is a move position, move rotation methods that you should use instead of setting the position and rotation, because you're going to screw with the rigid bodies contacts and otherwise other fields if you don't use the provided methods.
Yeah, for me, I'd say I do that when I'm going to do something other than just set the position. So I'll wrap it if I'm actually going to do any logic in there. Until then, I don't, just so that when I'm looking through the code, I'm not wondering what it's doing. I can see exactly it's just moving the transform. And I don't think like, oh, it's doing more than it's doing and have to hit F12 again to click through to see what's happening. So the second that I start adding in the extra logic, then I'll split it out. But until then, I just reference the transform.
I think I ran out of things here. Do we want to move to the next one?
Sure. Just the one last thing, and this is more because it's more on the topic rather than specifically a line here. We talked about the concept of time delta, and we didn't really discuss it before, but now we're kind of moving slightly past this is a comment on this code versus how would I do it different than some of the stuff here. And a personal preference too is, again, probably overkill. A lot of people wouldn't agree with me, but I don't use time.delta time in most of my scripts, because time.delta time is intrinsically tying this object to the life cycle rate or speed of the game at present. And if you have a car and a car is moving at the game speed, you might want a power-up or something that slows the car down. And now you have to start doing weird stuff where the car needs to know about time dilation and its own stuff to manage the concept of slowing down. If you instead have your own update function called I usually call it tick, but whatever you want to call it, have something that updates it that takes in a float delta, and you use that as if delta time, treat everything else exactly the same. Something else can iterate your characters and pass in time delta time. Suddenly everything's exactly the same, works exactly the same. But now, if you decide later, you know what, I'm going to do something like import Chronos and have different things running at different speeds, or have a like pocket of slow time, or have a special ability that doubles the car's speed. You can do all of that without changing a single line of code in the car. You just change the poll rate of the delta. So it's, again, entirely optional, just something I personally prefer doing.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because I literally did that as soon as I started my complex combat. I literally, the first class I made was Timed Actor, which had an ability to set the time scale by which it updates, so I can immediately decide, oh, this actor is frozen and will not move until something else happens, or this one is now hasted and he can act twice as fast. It's great when you have the ability to do that. There is the caveat: when you work with other systems, you have to make sure they support it as well, because some things rely on Unity's delta time by the nature of working with Unity and deciding this is the way.
Yeah, like for example, right? If you use DoTween, like I do, DoTween uses internally time delta time for its calculation of time, which means if you run a tween and you pause the game, your tweens stop. Now that might be desired behavior, but it might not if you're animating like a fader during a pause menu. Now, they're smart enough to have an option to update outside of delta time, but imagine if they didn't. Imagine if you were forever stuck with DoTween using the time. You could suddenly no longer use that library when the game is paused, and you're kind of screwed. So in general, I would avoid that. And the reason I do it, though, isn't really for the stylistic time dilation stuff I described. The actual reason I do it is if I want to run a test class where I test a script, I could say, test that it's working. I don't have to pass in actual time deltas. I could run tick and pass in the number 1 3 times, and it should have run 3 seconds. So I can test that a piece of code where it would end up after 3 seconds of time in a test script by just saying tick 1, tick 1, tick 1. How does it look after 3 seconds? Try and do that with time delta time. Try and test what happens after 3 seconds and ensure that it's the correct position. It's impossible.
It's even better when you try to test things at low FPS and you actually want to see what's going on at that low FPS. Unity does have target frame rate, but it's not as easy to use as the other available options, especially if you have to start hacking it in to see what's going on.
Yeah, Jason, you could run a test that moves you forward for some amount of time. You could make a play mode test. It's not going to be exactly as accurate because you're going to be yielding and waiting between frames.
You mean the coroutine editor mode play modes, right?
But you're not going to get that.
Yeah. Well, okay, we'll put it this way. If you're using an external DLL, which is referencing the Unity API, and you make a class which has time delta in it, how do you simulate it there?
That would be hard, yes. But you could run a play mode test, technically.
And it still doesn't address and it still doesn't address the fact that even if you had an ability to control some time provider, you don't have the option to do it per object, which might be desirable, which is the point of Chronos.
And actually, this is a side note too, because it's actually kind of a fun topic, is if you ever create something, like a great example, you've got this proceduralized generated terrain, you see a lot of people will make like a dungeon builder, and the dungeon will do some kind of walking algorithm that builds a lot of stuff. Sometimes you want to test that, or even just visualize it. And it's really nice to run that at different speeds, to be able to actually like see your dungeon build up, or click your fingers and have it instantly build. And if you control time, you can control time, right? That gives you complete and utter control over how that looks.
Actually, I want to add on this. In Terraria, we were rewriting the liquid system at one point, and when we wanted to see how liquids update, just for some context, Terraria is a two-dimensional game, and there's liquid. It can fall down, it can spread over tiles. There are solid tiles that it stops on. There are non-solid ones it can go through. There's air, which obviously it falls down through. There are different liquids that will not blend. So we have lava and honey, and if they touch water, they don't work together, and they create solid tiles. And there's also lava falls down slower than water, lots of moving parts. And at one point, we had to rewrite the system, and we wanted to see what happens frame by frame because something wasn't looking right. One very fun thing you can do is turn it into an enumerator and iterate over every single step and adding pause points whenever you want. And then you can cycle through everything, see what's going on, change it if you have to. It's extremely convenient. It also works for wall generation, and you can stop every step or every generation phase and see what's going on. It's a great thing to have.
I'm going to pull up a quick clip of what that looks like too, with the water in the simulation for anybody who hasn't seen it. I assume everybody watching has probably played or seen Terraria at least, but if not, there you go. Get a quick view of what that liquid looks like.
Yeah, so many moving parts in there. It's just convenient that we can set it frame by frame, or even not frame by frame, just click by click if necessary. And the entire game world can move completely independent of this. It's just this system now runs on an enumerator whenever we tell it to.
Sorry,
go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, for the next one, I'm going to throw it to you. It's going to be the leaderboard class, and I have a very strong feeling you're about to go on a big rant about delegates. So I'm going to go refresh my coffee while you do that.
The
this is kind of throwing
class?
off.
Let's pull it up.
No, I didn't cover it yet. Isn't this the one we covered 2 GameDev shows ago? The one with the...
I think we talked a little bit about the fake leaderboard and the leaderboard. Yeah,
we talked about the implementation leaks of this.
I believe.
Does he just want us to?
I don't remember how deep we went into this. Let's look at. So we've got an abstract class of a leaderboard, and then there's a playfab leaderboard and the fake leaderboard, right? So the playfab one, my guess is that this is an implementation to match up with the playfab one. Where's the playfab?
Yeah.
Oh.
We already discussed how the fake leaderboard does a lot of implementation leaks into what is expected of the playfab one.
Yes.
Just for example, if we just look at this leaderboard class and we close the finding files for a moment, we have an action on success for a load and an action on failure. But what should actually happen is the load shouldn't have callbacks for this, because it should just be an instant process by default. You don't tell it, hey, tell me when you're done. It should have events for when you're done, I want to know and update my stuff, instead of having to pass in a callback. Because multiple systems might want to know once loaded, do thing.
They might. I just wonder if this is actually his own code though, or just part of the playfab stuff. Part of the playfab.
It's under the Racer namespace, so it can't be unless they've renamed the namespace.
Racer.playfab. We got a playfab leaderboard. I just didn't know if maybe they took an existing playfab leaderboard code and then just kind of abstracted it out to give themselves a fake one, or if it already had a fake one in there too to kind of show how to do a leaderboard with playfab. I would assume that there are a bunch of examples that they give you for a leaderboard, and that was kind of the starting point here, and probably where the load signature came from. My guess is that the playfab has another what do we got here? Some methods, a login failed method, and okay. This is invoking. So yeah, the playfab manager's method wants 2 callbacks. That's why.
Right, but that's another example though. But see, this is a bleeding of implementation. So here's another kind of fun point to this. What happens is, if you design code around the APIs you're using, you end up locking yourself into their implementation. So just because playfab happens to look a certain way, you've made your abstraction of a high score system use the exact contract they did, and now it kind of defeats the point of an abstraction if you're going to literally use the contract that they're using. So personally, I actually use tasks for my asynchronous functions like this. That's overkill for this. But if you're going to do this kind of premise, like, all you really need is something, have some sort of callback object, and hand the object to this, and that object can have the various different things to do. In short, your leaderboard abstraction or base class doesn't have to look anything like the one for playfab. You can the whole point of an adapter pattern is to adapt one thing to another. I would probably go one step further, and I would say a leaderboard is a perfect example of what I call an optional service. And because it's an optional service, aka the game functions perfectly if there is no leaderboard, it's just a nice to have. That's a perfect candidate for an interface. And then with the interface, I do what's called the null object pattern, which is no leaderboard. And I would put a no leaderboard into the game manager or whatever's calling it. And so by default, everything works in the condition no leaderboard is ever provided. And now it's an optional thing you could plug in that would add a feature, but nothing is going to break or change or require it if it isn't.
Well, then you can't assign it though, if it's an interface.
You can't. Well, the way I do in that case is, I know it's a little bit hacky, but the way I do it in that case is I would use a game object and I would say leaderboard object, and then I could call get component of type leaderboard on that if it exists, and then set it if it doesn't. It makes it a bit more abstract in what you're doing, but it does mean the code will always work in the event there is no leaderboard. Unlike now, where the event that you're not using playfab, when you try to use this, it would break if you don't at least write some implementation of a leaderboard. And I don't like the idea of code forcing you to have to write other code before it even works at a base level.
Yeah, and that's what this fake leaderboard is just there to fill in a bunch of, which I can see the implementation reason for a fake leaderboard too, because you want to fill up a bunch of fake data, see how the system is all working without having real people play through and go through there. So I can kind of see it. Yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about this one though, but I understand your idea of just changing out that abstraction so that it's not so tied directly to it or directly to the one that you're using there. But
plus in general, having string there is just if you talked about this when I was gone, I don't know if you mentioned the general bad idea of having abstracted variables like that.
We didn't get to it yet. You were only gone for a moment.
okay,
Okay.
wait, which one were you talking about? The statistic name?
I don't know. You can say where you were. Any of these is fine. Basically, the problem with using action string is what's string there on failure string. Is that if I submitted a score and I get back an action with type string, is that the score I try to submit? Is it the person I try to submit to? Is it the state of the server I try to send it to? Is it the
failure reason?
Yeah, and it probably is a failure reason, but is that failure reason a failure reason ID that I'm meant to look up elsewhere, or is it a failure reason that's a string message I'm supposed to play to the users? What is it? I don't know, because it's an arbitrary concept of a failure with something back. If you're going to have callbacks, have the callbacks return an object. Now, I think we've discussed this before, and your preference is to use literal name delegates. Personally, I prefer actions, but I would create my own wrapper type. I would have action of type leaderboard response or something, and it would result in the same kind of output.
Like a leaderboard failure with a string message on it?
Something like that, yeah.
Like something like that. And then you would
it also means, which it may not seem important to you, but if you use this and later on you're like, oh, I would also like to return an error code that connects to something from my documentation, you can do that and you don't break a ton of contracts down the line. And that's one of those things where if you didn't, because again, it's probably fine if it's your game and your code and your leaderboards, but the entire point of abstraction is what's called DLLs or dynamic link libraries, where somebody somewhere can find out your game has a leaderboard and can go make a leaderboard for their platform and give it to you. And now without any extra code, that's supported in your system, which is really cool. That's kind of the benefit of abstraction. But if you've got a certain contract which says it looks like this, in order to receive or send a high score, it looks like this, and you just say, you know what, I'll just add an ID here. All of a sudden, everyone who's ever made anything related to your contract is broken, and they have to rewrite their code. But if you have something that abstracts that, you can save that problem.
But it's worth noting here on that on failed stack, if you kind of follow it up, the actual failure gives back a playfab error. It's just getting turned down into a string later or up this chain a bit. So you actually are having that error. So this change is, I guess, kind of intentional and probably doesn't necessarily need to be. Oh, there's a generate error report message. That's why. That's what this is doing. Interesting.
God, so what is this horrible one-line appender? Where's the spacing?
Ugh. What's that?
Just like, speaking of formatting, what is this formatting on 710 playfab? God, split each append onto a new line. Ugh. And also, if you're going to use append, why use /n? That's what append line is for. That's stupid. That is not the right way to use the append function. Look, append /n error. It's literally append or append line. You're using a string builder to avoid the cost of using string concatenation, and now you're using an inline. Whatever. It's fine. It's fine.
It's example code, right? This is the PlayFab example stuff. So, and I assume they've tried to make it relatively generic and simple so that it just applies to everybody's project. There's a little opinionation or opinion as possible, but who knows?
And on a side note too, this is just one thing. I know this isn't your code, but if we're going to review code, we're reviewing code. 708 is null or empty. 1, use the lowercase s for string. You do not need to reference the type class for this one. And 2, it should be is null or white space, which is the newer version, which also takes into account white spaces as an empty string. Because in this context, is null or empty would allow a string made of white spaces to qualify as a correct error message when it isn't in this context.
Yeah,
and it's really frustrating when some APIs actually give back a single empty space. Like, how? Why are you doing this to me?
Or the worst one is when you get an API which returns, depending on its mood, a JSON object or a string message in arbitrary cases. It's like, I'm trying to bind to your response message. Give me a bloody response I can bind to.
All right, you guys want to take a look at maybe one more class and then start going over the rest of the stuff we wanted to chat about today before we wrap things up?
Sure. I have notes for either the prefab spawner, the terrain generator, or the terrain segment. Pick your choice.
I'm going to do a quick scan and see what's more interesting on my notes.
Also pickup. There's a lot to talk about. We didn't get to it.
I think we should look at the prefab spawner or the pickup one. So because they're just going to apply generally to a lot more people. And not
I think
as many people
terrain generator is going to confuse people. Yeah, so I would say go prefab spawner. Let's go prefab spawner.
Okay. Do you have notes of your own, Jason?
Well, a lot of this is going to repeat because for me it's more about architectural stuff, like a giant while loop with content inside of it. Never have some giant thing with stuff inside of it. If you're saying while x to y, name the y. Take that entire contents of that while loop and say do some stuff. Whatever the stuff is, always wrap it in some function inside of the loop you're doing.
Yeah. So we talked about this before, but this script has the awake. It has the active serialized bool again. Just because they want to disable the behavior, I would have renamed it to disabled or something else. This time it actually works. It doesn't have a bug, but the point is still it doesn't have a life cycle. It is enabled. I still want this to do nothing with this one boolean. So it should be like disable behavior or something like that.
Plus, it's worth noting as well, like depending on your context, there is literally a .enabled thing on mono behaviors.
But you can literally just turn it off. Called from another mono behavior that it's attached to as well, or that it's a child of. It looks like. So that's why they're using that flag so you can turn it on and off.
Yeah, the problem here is, again, because it's an active flag that's made manually because this object does not have a life cycle method. Therefore, Unity does not expose the checkbox that says, is it enabled or not? So they have to create their own checkbox and then consume it manually. It's stupid on both Unity's and this code's part is unideal, but if you want to disable a behavior, I wouldn't call it active. Again, it's prone to is enabled or set active or etc. etc.
So one that I have is a big one that we won't have time to really unpack. So I'm just going to mention it now, and it could be something for another day. This is probably more than anything the thing that I give out to Andrew for the most in some form or another. It's usually manifests in different ways, but it's the same sentiment across the board, which is line 15 is the concept of a thing that has a thing which has things in it which has things in it. And this is a classic example of over egging a collection. Like what you're saying here is I want a list of things, but a list doesn't do everything I need. So I need a dictionary, but a dictionary doesn't do everything I need. So I need a dictionary which has a list inside, because you're using, like, the whole point of this is that there's all of this stuff going on that the collection type you're not doing doesn't encapsulate. So to put it another way, this is clearly a pool. It is a pool of stuff. And that could be quite easily a named quantity. It could be a thing called pool, which has stuff inside of it to do pool related things. And so if you ever have this nested stuff in stuff in stuff, ask yourself if there's a way for you to just actually encapsulate its behavior and apply behavior to it. Like, how much easier would this code read and work? And later on, when you're doing for each thing, in each thing, for each thing, oh, there's the pool object as well. Okay, we're going to get into territory there.
Yeah, I wanted to say it's not even the pool yet.
Okay, well, either way, my point is it is a thing with things, and whatever this object represents, clearly there are behaviors around it, such as for eaching elements in elements or whatever, encapsulated. Like, you've literally got a complicated object with complicated behaviors. Don't try to use nested stuff in stuff, and like, because again, you'll get into this weird scenario where you start having to do index.listThing.index.listThing, and you'll lose kind of track of it, when all you're really saying is add, please, or do thing, and you can encapsulate that if it's its own type.
So you'd replace the dictionary of game object list game object with another class that's like a prefabs list class, or whatever the best name for this class ends up being, right?
Yeah. For purpose's sake, what this does is it's creating a unique pool. It lets you manage a unique pool per game object prefab. So you can say this is a pool for this type of game object, and here are all the instances of the things in that pool, as far as I can understand. As far as I can understand it.
And this also proves here why architecture is such an important thing. Imagine if this was just a pool object instead, and you added object to a pool or not. If you wanted to add the behavior later, where adding to a pool actively subdivides it into other pools, imagine making a pool and then a subdividing pool, which is an implementation of pool, which internally handles it by subpooling. So if it was its own class, that extra version or behavior could be added as a new thing, not rewriting or existing confusing code. Because at the end of the day, it's the same thing. Give me thing, here's thing. If it internally does extra magic for different reasons, you can do that without exposing it to the terrain stuff or whatever the stuff we're currently working on.
Okay, yeah, it looks like it grabs the populated instances and just moves them over to the next segment as a segment becomes available. Unless it's reinstantiating them. Yeah,
so
I assume place is moving them, not spawning them, right?
Yeah, as far as I can understand it, it tries to get prefabs to place, and whenever you move a segment, it tries to replace them. There's a method at the bottom that disables the current instances just so you can clear out the pool and reuse it later.
Yeah, so it disables them all and puts them all back into the pool, and then place grabs them from a pool and puts them into the world somewhere.
Exactly.
Okay.
And
then prefab list is all the placed instances of it on. Okay, so these are they're not really a pool. It's like a collection of the placed instances of the pool that they care about for this. That's a little bit abstracted away from the actual pooling behavior.
Yeah, so like a great example of this is this around line 68 down to 71-ish area. Like I guess to really dive down to what we're talking about here, it's called obfuscating intent. So we have to read through these lines. If not, prefab list dot contains key prefab list dot add prefab new list, the prefab add. Okay, what is that really saying? Well, it's saying if there isn't already a prefab list, make a new one and then add this to it. But what's our actual intent? Our intent isn't to make a new list of game object. We didn't decide that. Our actual intent is add to pool. So instead of writing add, or create pool set or whatever,
or collect into this specific pool.
Yeah, it's a little confusing because it's pulling it from a pool already. It's already got a whole separate pooling system that it's grabbing from. It's like this other separate pool of placed objects, which isn't.
But I guess my point is though, it's, all of this
more
stuff,
of a list of placed ones, right?
Yeah, but okay. Well, regardless of what it does, that's not important. What matters is the fact that in order for it to do its job, we have to know it's a list, know it's a dictionary. Which, by the way, it's a dictionary called list. Let's not get into that. We have to know that it's a dictionary. Call contains key. Inquire about its position. do new stuff, and then add new elements to it, when none of that's actually our intent right now. Our intent should be thing dot here's thing, take it. Take thing. And internally, if it needs to do stuff before it can take thing, it can do that. And so every time you do that, where you expose the details and then have things have to know to, like again, right here, on line 140, you have to know that's a dictionary, to know that it's stored in keys and values, to know that you're actually trying to iterate the value list, not the key list. All of that just so that you can add an object to available queue. What if it was instead add, and then internally it would, if it needs to, do an iteration, get the thing, do the stuff, add the values, right? None of this is the job of a prefab spawner. A prefab spawner should say, I have a pool, I want stuff, get me stuff. And it doesn't need to know any of this information.
Right. Well, this is the info on what it spawned, right?
Which
I
one
just
are you-
renamed it to placed prefabs because I think that that's a more clear name on it, because this is actually this dictionary
placed instances, but yeah.
Yeah, or yeah, placed instance is a much better name. Or rename again.
And then you can search for placed instances of this thing. You get the list of the placed instances of that thing, which is what this provides you. The dictionary provides you with.
Right.
I know this is, I don't want to, yeah, I want to show this first because it really is highlighting this. I know that this is an abstract concept and it's very hard to explain some of this. So it's a little bit of self-promotion again, but I want to bring up this tiny potion example because I think it demonstrates this problem in literal code, which might be easier to explain.
Let's do it. Tiny potion.
It's an oldie but a goodie. I'm getting a lot more mileage out of this than I ever thought I would. And I only wrote it to answer one question in Discord, which is funny. So, first of all, think of it from the same perspective. You had spawning things in pools, used by things, which did stuff, which did terrain, all of this stuff. Now, I've got here a world with some characters and potions. Characters can drink potions, and then potions change stats. Now, technically, it's got the same kind of relationship. Somewhere, there's like a dictionary or something, somewhere, of stats. Somewhere, there's a character who has those, and then somewhere, the act of drinking a potion should modify stats and things about a player. But I want to demonstrate how that information is irrelevant to so many layers of the application. So if we look at this start bit at run, it's the separation of my intent from the code I wrote. My intent is to create a world which has some characters. I add them to the world, and then they drink potions of varying types. And again, it still does all of the stuff we described. There are dictionaries, there are lists, stuff is moving, whatever. But that's not the intent. The intent is very clearly thing drinks potion. Now we can dive down through and have a look at like how that works and what it's doing. So I guess let's go to a potion. So I think that's under, I don't remember where. Let's see. It's under the example one at the bottom. Yeah. And then I think potions and then potion. Right. So a potion, in order to be drank, needs to apply whatever it does to a player. So how do I do that? Well, in this case, a potion is a collection of effects, and the effects are applied to an actor. There's no dictionary, actor, key, stat, player, dot, stats, dot, get, none of that. My intention is, I have a potion, it has effects, for each effect, apply it to whoever just drank it. It reads the intent, it's very clear, and you don't care or know whether it's dictionaries or lists or stacks or lists of dictionaries, none of that matters. It's all about intent. And now, with that, we can go one more layer down and have a look at the concept of a character. So if we jump back out to the parent folder here, the one above that, and then under actors, and then just let's go with actor. Yeah, it's that one, and then actors, and then actor. So a player or an actor consists of stats and flags. Stats are like, are you dead? Are you alive? Are you invincible? Or flags are those. And then stats are health and ammo and whatever. And again, so if you drink a potion, what does that do? Well, this may seem weird, but when I drink a potion, how do you apply it? Well, you apply the potion to this character. And so potions apply each effect to it. So I won't go down this laborious thing forever, but the point is, nowhere here are you see. Not yet have we seen the words dictionary or really list other than the basics of stats and things, because that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the intention I have. So you have seen actors, potions, stats, and flags. Somewhere in there is the need for dictionaries and other collection types, but that's not relevant to what we're talking about. And so I hope, as you can see here, you can still use all of that stuff, but try to think in terms of your intention. Your code should read like what you're trying to do, and all that other stuff is implementation details. So if you ever find yourself writing dictionary.key.list.thing where index I, it's like, well, where's my code gone? My code's in here somewhere. My intention is in here in this sea of words. What was I trying to do? So try to get your code to read like your intent, not like the words of code.
Right. I think so. The question in there too is just my intent was to remember which prefabs were placed so I can return them to the pool when the terrain segment is done, which is pretty much what it's doing. So, what would you, I guess, recommend in place of what you saw there then, in place of that dictionary with the keys and the lists of the entries for each key that need to get returned back into the pool?
I guess I would maybe create an object and we'll call it like placed items. And that placed items might internally have a dictionary or list or whatever. Like again, I haven't looked in exactly what it's doing per se, but the point is that list, that dictionary of list represents something and it has a name. I don't know what it is, but it has a name.
I kind of want to bring it up, but a pool already should have the functionality of knowing what is active within the pool.
Right. So one option could be if all of those objects need to get deactivated, then you could just turn them all off. But my guess is that it's because there's some terrain segments behind, some that we're on, and some ahead. You don't want to. He doesn't want to flip off all the ones from it. He just wants to flip off the ones from the segment that's behind you. Right. So you do. He does know which ones are in the pool. He just needs to know which ones are in the pool from that past segment, and that's what this is trying to keep track of.
Yeah,
Well,
but
then, but then isn't there now though, by definition of what you just said, a segment pool, which is a pool of segments, and a segment pool might have a flag on it that says "is behind me" or "is in front of me." All of a sudden, you could say, "Turn on things in front," "turn off," like you know what I mean.
But
Like,
that's what
you're
he's doing,
describing,
right? He's turning off that segment and then finding
Yeah,
right?
all
But
of the
show me the line
children
of code
that.
that does that, though. That's the point, right? Like I'm not seeing that because I'm seeing dictionaries and lists and indexes and keys. Like if that's the intent, there needs to be a named intent for it.
Or even you could just extract the part that pulls into a separate class and just say, this is the pool that manages what this prefab spawner wants to do. Create something, add it to pool. When you're out, clear the pool. It shouldn't, the implementation of the pooling should not be part of the prefab spawner that is just meant to spawn prefabs. It might be a prefab spawner from a pool. It might be a prefab spawner without a pool. It might be a prefab spawner that doesn't even spawn prefabs and instead just says, I did it. But the pool provides it what it would spawn and keeps it until it wants to clear it. So just an implementation detail shouldn't have the entire class implementation in there.
Yeah, like for example, let's just have a quick example here. I think I have something here I can demonstrate. Yeah, here we go. So go back to that example, the thing out. This hopefully will highlight exactly what I'm saying. Under the actor here. So an actor has stats and flags. So one of the things it has is stats, as you said, like whether your health is high or low or whatever. Now, stats have behaviors separate from an actor. A stat, you could possibly fill it or whatever. Now, I could just have a list of stats here, but stats themselves have an ability to refill your stats. And so there is a unique piece of behavior on the concept of a stat collection, which is refill my stats or refill whichever ones I want. And so, or finding them. So here you can see I've got behaviors on this object that allow me to talk to and interact with the concept of stats as a collection rather than individually. So in this case, I have something called stats.fill, and then stats.fill might fill its stats. So again, you could just store this on a list of objects, but by doing this, for example, look at line 16. That's creating a new stat with a maximum value. Now, I could just have a list of stats and I could add a stat and create a new one and set max, but I've intrinsically said a type of stat is stats object, a collection of stats. There are stats that are max. There are stats that don't have the max or default to the max or whatever. I can add behaviors to the concept of stats separately from an individual stat. And we're talking about this idea of a pool versus a segment pool versus a historical pre-patient whatever. And so, yeah, you can separate them out. And my point is, if there's unique behaviors to a collection of things, put them on that unique behavior.
Cool. Well, I think we should probably jump off the code review stuff for a little while. We got just a few more minutes and a couple more topics to hit. And we talked a lot about this code. Hopefully it was somewhat helpful. And we'll probably just jump on and do some more code reviews in the future if you guys are up for it. I think it'd be interesting to see some totally different projects and see what kinds of things we can kind of find and come up with. But that was definitely a lot of fun. And I also want to get Andrew back in because Andrew
I have been listening and thinking, this is in the chat, I'm thinking, oh shit, I do that. Oh man, okay, maybe I should do this differently. So I enjoy this because it's a whole lot of information really fast, but like I keep seeing things where sometimes, oh, I did the good thing. I did it the right way. Great. And other times I'm like, uh-oh, I did it the wrong way. Or not necessarily the wrong way, but not the most ideal way. And there's a better way. And so it's nice to sit here and just think, I should relook at some things.
And to be fair,
you guys did a good job of calling out the good things too, by the way. Just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, and I really can't stress enough too. Like, we are not talking about, like, there's a fundamental difference between writing code, solving a problem, it's fine, versus, like, very clearly, I think it's pretty obvious, my perspective comes from enterprise software with thousands of users and a test suite and stuff. And so a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about is the trade-off between scaling future problems and architecting to support clarity of intent in a system whereby you might have 100 people working on the same code base who may not know what it's doing. And like the fact that, to be honest, a bunch of relatively senior developers are reading the code going, what does this do? I don't know. I think it does this, is a sign that there is intent lost. That's all I'm really getting across. The specifics don't really matter, but should all of us really be slightly confused about what a pooling type class should do? Like, realistically, should we, given how much coding we do? And the answer is probably not. And so I'm not even saying it's wrong. It's perfectly fine. If it works, it works. But if your code doesn't get across what you're trying to do, then that's a failure of naming and intent. So it's not about the code. The code actually works, but it's about the intentionality. And so that's why I'm harping on about that topic, because that's the part that to me is like the thing that people miss the most.
And I just want to stress out, if the code works, really don't mind it too much. These are just tips. We don't try to make you feel bad. The code works. You have nothing to fear. Here are just some tips if maybe you want to have less problems in the future.
Yeah, I wouldn't get in and just start changing things just to make it. I've seen people do that. I've watched people do it. I've done it myself. Like jump in and try to just improve the code for no technical benefit at all. And it always ends up, almost always ends up being a mess and a rabbit hole, and I overcomplicate things and tend to confuse myself. So I just take all of these things as like as you're building it out more, go back through, rewatch and remember the different things we were talking about and see if you can apply those instead of trying to force yourself to change things.
It kind of reminds me of that. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and absolutely do not take all the lessons here and start implementing them over everything in projects you work with others without letting them know why you are doing what you're doing. Because usually when you work with others, there's this skill floor that everybody understands what's going on. And if you suddenly start to up it extremely and nobody else can work with your code anymore, you're in for a hell, because now all the tasks that they could do before are tied to you. And if you can't work on this specific thing at this specific time, you're screwing everybody else, and it also adds more workload to you. Some might call it job security. Yeah, you're taking ownership of it, and while some people would argue this is job security, it's not the good kind of job security. You want to deliver value to people, not lock them out of having any value because you're the only one who can provide it now.
Yeah.
I've done that myself in the past. You find out new tech, new tricks, and you start to bring them in, and then slowly realize you've just made it so that nobody else understands your code, and every time somebody looks at it, they just hate you. And Oh, whoops! I just turned my volume up a little bit. Am I better now? Hopefully, I'm not too loud.
Way better.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had that where they can't read the code, and then I'm trying to explain it constantly, trying to tell them how you work with this system, and I learned my lesson quickly after doing that. I think the second or third time, I was like, this is not what I want to do. I don't want to be supporting this because I added in some cool stuff. I want you to still be able to do your job and end up with a good product. Go ahead.
If you want, I think people have to remember the first step in knowing something is not knowing it. Literally, the first step every time is not knowing it before you know it. And so keep in mind, we've all done this journey. And I had exactly the same problem where I used to just grab all the new toys I was given and throw them at my project and make it worse. And so if you want an actionable way to apply this stuff that doesn't break your existing code, the trick is consider it like there's a tool shed and you've always been using the same two tools, and we've just pointed the others out and given you a brief example of how they work. But rather than use them, go back to what you were doing, and as you work, ask yourself when you're about to do something if something feels off. If you have a vague memory that somebody somewhere told you there might be a different way to do this, and rather than applying it directly, stop and look at your tools and say, what would happen if I use this one? Okay, what would happen if I use that one? What's the benefits and costs of going this route? And the trick is, if you want to use these things responsibly, don't apply them because they sound fun or that people have told you they're the right way. Apply them as they directly solve problems. So if you ever find yourself writing an interface or an abstract class because I've made a gun and I'll probably have lots of guns, so I should probably have a gun interface, you haven't solved any problem. You've added more code without anything benefiting from it. And there's that great quote, if I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter, implying it's very easy the first time to write it. It's to write it well is actually the hard part. It's the thing that you should slow down and clean it up. And so likewise, it's very easy to just say, oh, I'll just throw in layers and abstractions. In fact, don't do that. Stop and solve a problem, then pause and go, is this the right way? What are my risking or trade-offs and whatever? And then apply things that actively make it easier or better. So all of this stuff we talked about, I'm saying them from the perspective of like, these will scale in these ways. This is where it'll break. This is where things might need to go. But if they aren't there yet, don't apply it. Apply them as they solve problems.
And I would also just add on to that, if you start applying something and find that it's just getting worse, don't be afraid to undo it and just delete your change and try again. Either try a different pattern or different option. I do that all the time personally. I experiment with things. I get an idea. I'm like, oh, I think I want to do this. And then 20 minutes later, I'm like, oh, that was a ridiculous idea. I'm going to delete the entire thing. I'm starting it over. Let me try it again. So don't get married to your code. Remember that you can just delete it and recreate something better every time.
I don't think people realize that we do that all the time. Like, as someone who does architecture, people always say, oh, you just write your big architecture thing. I have genuinely, on multiple occasions, written code and then did the big refactor and then went, oh, I hate using this now. It is really complicated and unnecessary. And just burned it to the ground and went back to the simple, unrefactored way. Because if you make a mistake by over-engineering, it's easy to do, like, go back to what was better. Like, that's why if there's anything like a catchphrase, it's write code you enjoy using. Because there's no better like code smell sense detector than I don't like using this. Perfect example, I showed Andrew tree stuff because trees is how it solve a problem that he had. But objectively, it made his code more confusing in a way that he wasn't getting value out of. And he chose not to use it. And that is 100% the right choice. Because if it's not adding value, but it is adding confusion, don't use it.
I just wanted to point out, it's not just code that you might want to try multiple times until you get a solution that works for you. Even when you make game features or game feature implementations, you might try to make them 40 different times before you're happy with something. There are archives of hundreds of Terraria sprites never used because we were trying different things and going, oh, maybe we'll try it this way, maybe we'll try it that way, maybe we can just make this one white instead of black, etc. This is not visible enough. Iteration is important to figure out how you can work most happily with whatever you're working with. Doesn't matter if it's code, doesn't matter if it's art, doesn't matter if it's game design.
It's a really good point. I think we get stuck in that code bubble sometimes thinking about it. Don't even think to mention those things. So, Andrew, what are you iterating on now?
My big thing right now is redoing my backend stuff, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to make these. It's basically data management and stuff, and the best ways to make those flexible, yet also easy to use, in a variety of projects. So anyone can grab it.
Elaborate a little bit? What kind of data here are you talking about managing, and how is it getting managed? This is all in your new game, right? And
Yeah, it's all for my new
packages?
game, but yeah, but I want to. The idea would be that you got things like items, and I'm calling it items, but it could be anything. It could be your bad guys. It could be, who knows, anything that's just a list of things, a collection of different things. And then you've got your stats and skills, which are going to be stats and skills, things that you can learn or that keep track of a thing. So gold could be a stat. You know, and hidden, they don't have to be public. They could be hidden from the player as well. It's something you want to track. And then they all have to kind of work together, so that they can talk to each other, and an item can affect your stats and all that stuff. And, you know, when I think about the reason why I started this was when I was starting Legend of the Stones and starting to write out, oh, these are my stats. I was like, shit, I'm going to change these. You know, I know I'm going to add these. I know I'm going to change things out. And I realized I need an easier way to manage all the data, knowing that there's most of the data I have no idea what it's going to be, but I know I'm going to need it at some point. And then once I have that baseline, it becomes much more easy to create an inventory system that is more, you know, opinionated in regards to how it works, or a loot system, where it's like, okay, well, a loot box could be a chest. It could be a drawer in a in a dresser in a room. It could be the top of a table, and where all the stuff on the top of the table is itself a loot box, or it could be a goblin's body that you're about to loot. And once I have this backend, I'm like, oh, the loot box is really easy to make, because it just says, give me a bunch of items from this other data structure that exists. And I was going through that process, and then Jason rightly pointed out that I could have done it better. And so I went back, and I've been basically doing it better, so that version 2 will be far more flexible and convenient. If that
It's
makes
like
sense.
Groundhog Day. Andrew keeps trying to get work done, and I keep resetting the clock on him every so often.
True. It's totally true. It's totally true.
Well, just don't smash Jason's like button.
Yeah. I try to do my streams only when Jason's asleep, but he doesn't sleep. So that's the problem.
That is a big issue.
So my trade-off is I've been kind of leaving it at least an hour of work before I jump in. That way he gets something done before I start derailing things.
Yeah.
Before you have to undo it all.
Yeah.
Nice. So are you still streaming like almost daily, or is it every day now?
It's not every day, but it's most days. I've been what I find myself doing is some days. One day last week I didn't stream at night, but then some days I'll be like, oh, maybe I'll take a night off. I won't stream tonight. But then I'm like, I should just stream it. You know, in the end, it's fun. I get a lot out of the people who do come and hang out, point out things that I miss, which is always a good thing. Yeah. And so it's better in many ways. I am a little slower when I stream versus when I'm not streaming, but that's okay. I think it's a good trade-off. Yeah. And it's fun, and you know, it grows the channel, I'm sure, too, and you know, introduces more people to what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And there's of course all the 80s song references, you know, can't go by.
Yes, there were some fair amount of 80s song references last night.
There was one question in chat I just wanted to briefly answer before it pops away, and it was just about, do you think it's worth moving from England to America for game development? I only wanted to pop this up because I was talking to my buddy Dave yesterday, and he's going to hop on the show sometime, and he moved from England to America, not for game development, for a marriage, but we were having a discussion about game development, his studio there, all the things that had gone on. So if you're interested in that question, hang around. Maybe next week or the week after that, Dave will be on, and we'll definitely bring that up and talk about it, because I think it'll be interesting. Let's get a link to Andrew's stream posted up. I'll put that in the description and in the chat. You can send me one of those over right now. We can jump on. Oh, Dave from Warped Imagination's here right now. Dave, you want to just hop onto the call right now and answer that question? Restream makes it really easy. I can email you the link and you can hop on in the next 30 seconds or so, and you can just answer the question on whether or not that's worth it. I'm going to send it over to him. We'll get him in here, hopefully, unless he's busy or in the middle of something. And then let's get Andrew's link posted up here. So that's starting in just about 30 minutes. Got the link right there for the YouTube video. It's in chat now, and I'm going to drop it into the description. And before I forget, I'm also going to beg everybody who's still here watching live or watching later, come by later, hit the like button, drop a comment, or say something in chat, say hello. It really helps a lot, and make sure you subscribe so you get the notifications for the next one. Also, for upcoming code reviews, if you've got something you want reviewed and you have a project that's playable and some code for us to take a look at, just email it over to me at jason@game.courses, and I'll add it to the list, and we'll take a look at it. No promises on which ones we're going to actually be able to review live and stuff, but it'll at least get it onto the list and be a possibility there. So let's see.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I would say, and just keep in mind that when we're trying to review code, one thing that I want to be just cautious about is I know a lot of people want their code reviewed, but the truth is we're trying to review code for people to learn something from, and sometimes code, which is perfectly fine or worth reviewing or not, either case, it just might not have something that we think is a valuable thing to talk about. For example, we've covered a lot of stuff here that realistically would probably say the same thing again about other code. So we might be actively trying to pick code that has different things to talk about. So if your code isn't something that we pick to talk about, it might just be because we would just be saying something that we would have said in a different video, you know?
Right. And when you do like real code reviews in an office, you won't run into that issue so much, because generally, like, once you've shown the problem and you resolve the issues, those issues don't keep coming up. So you get new things and new stuff. But when it's just a bunch of people sending stuff in, you get a lot of the same issues, because a lot of the issues are just common. All right, I'm going to pull in David, and we're going to find out if you should move to America from England for game development, or if you should just stay in England. What's the answer, David?
Well, firstly, you guys start way too early in the morning on a Sunday, and half the time I'm mostly asleep. So I literally popped on about half an hour ago. Yeah, I mean, I moved here because I married an American, and she was like, "Do you want to live in England with the weather, or do you want to move to LA where we can be near the beach?" And I was like, beach. So I kind of lucked out. So it wasn't a green card wedding. I actually do love her. But yeah, no. So yeah. It's a different sort of atmosphere here in LA than it is in England, but you're still doing the same sort of dev. There are certain aspects like non-compete clauses that are different when you're in LA to when you're actually in England. In England, you have non-compete clauses that can affect you if you want to do stuff outside of the game development, if you're working in a AAA studio, for instance. Whereas here in California, you can't have non-compete clauses. So
you can, they just can't enforce them, right?
Yeah, they just can't enforce them. So they don't exist. So anyone that passes me a non-complete clause, I'm like, yeah, no. But so that has to be taken into consideration when you look at that. But as far as the amount of work that's there, it depends where you are in England. I mean, London, where I was, has tons of game dev studios, and all the way down through Brighton and on the south coast. And of course, there's some up in Liverpool. Used to work with the guys that did Wipeout up that way. Whereas in LA, there's a ton of game studios around here hiring. I've worked with a lot of people that worked out in the game studios here. When I actually moved to LA, I moved on to the enterprise stuff and used game engines for stuff like the NFL, did the Super Bowl and things like that. So it's a little bit different with the sort of development I do now. I don't work directly for game studios all the time, except passing them concepts and doing some design stuff for them every now and again. Nowadays, my stuff's more immersive entertainment for big facilities and stuff like that, even though I am still developing the odd game. So if there's a specific question in there about moving to LA, LA is nicer. It's better weather.
I think that we should clarify on that, because, I mean, the question was, should it move from England to America for game industry? And that, I think that when you compare England and America, it's hard to remember, like, England is like the size of a tiny portion of America. Like it's like the size of LA County, right?
It's the size of California. Roughly.
Is it actually as big as California in actual size?
Close. pretty close. You're looking at that world map and it's always distorted. I think it's pretty close to go. Somebody's going to just say, no, it's this small.
But even then, that's still like a 50th of the state or of the country, right? So you've got to move to the right parts of America was really my point. If you want to get into the game industry, there are only a few tiny parts of America where there's actually a big game industry, where it would be better than England and not worse, because London is going to be a bigger game industry than most of America, except for like Austin, Seattle, San Francisco, LA, and maybe one or two places on the East Coast.
I mean, West Coast is basically where it's at for everything. Just listen to the rap music. No, West Coast is basically for game development is the place to be when you've got Seattle and Washington all the way down through LA and all the rest. There's been more moving to Austin, tax rates and all that sort of thing, making a lot of companies start up there. The other thing to consider, if you're just thinking about, I want to work in the games industry, Canada has a massive games industry. Like it dwarfs a lot of parts of America as well. So if you're thinking, I just want to work in the games industry, where should I be? It's more to the point of what company do you want to work for? What games do you want to make? And why are you moving? I mean, if you just want, I helped a company called Hutch Games back in the day, which has grown and just got bought last year, doing some of the first mobile games. We had a few number ones on iOS and Android. That company's amazing. And it's right there in London. It's an indie game studio that now probably could be considered indie because it's quite big now. It's got like 50 to 100 people out there. But then all the way down through Brighton, there's amazing game companies that are building there. I worked personally at Sony Computer Entertainment, the AAA studio in London. Just around the corner from us was Microsoft, building their new studio at the time. This is 15 years ago, so I'm old. But there's loads there. So more to the point.
Bossa Studios down there too. I did a game jam over in Bossa Studios office. They were pretty cool.
Yeah, and you've got Google around the corner.
That's Surgeon Simulator and that, by the way.
There's loads of stuff in London, and Liverpool has a lot as well. But for me, it's not. If you want to move to America, why are you moving to America? Like, is there something there that you want to have in America that you can't get in England? And if that's sunshine, then yeah, fair enough. California, join the club. And that's one of the reasons I moved over here. But yeah, it's more of a question of there's every genre of game studio in London. There's every genre of game studio in California, whether it be in LA or up in Seattle. And in Canada, there's every genre of game studio. What do you want? And with the fact that there's so much remote working now, and it's become such a big part of the work atmosphere, I helped develop an XR training studio up in Canada for a company, and I was remote for them, but I was doing their lead stuff for that. They take remote people from across the world to go and work there. So it's not like you have to travel to do that. So there's more questions about why you want to do America when you don't absolutely have to for some of that stuff.
I mean, for example, John Romero has a game studio in Ireland of all places. So if that's the world we live in, right? It doesn't really matter anymore in terms of location.
No.
Much.
I assume that's just for tax avoidance.
Not
Whenever anyone tells me they're in Ireland, except for Jason's story, I just assume that they're trying to avoid taxes. And that's why they're in Ireland.
Well, then he actually lives in Galway in his tax avoidance house. Then, because that's
fair enough. It may not be the same situation.
Yeah,
but yeah, it's definitely. I wanted to know interesting the remote stuff that's been changing lately. I've seen almost everybody now is open to remote positions, and the positions outside of the country seem to be less and less of an issue. I've been in a couple places where that was like a big thing, and now it seems like it's been, I don't know, with just the way stuff's been changing the last 2 years, it seems like it's been opening up a lot more.
It's caused a nightmare for quite a few of the AAA studios. I was on a talk with a guy from Activision, I think last year. It was for a load of students across the country. And he was saying when the whole Corona thing kicked off, moving all of the computers and the security to move everybody remote was an absolute nightmare. Mm-hmm. But once it was done, they don't know whether they're going to all go back in or not. There's a lot to be said for working closely, but then I'm older, so I like the office atmosphere a little bit. But at the same time, I've been a remote worker for many years. It's very rare that I work for a company that has to have me come in. I did some work up in Culver City, which is just North LA, that I actually went in for a lot, but that was because we were location based. So we were taking out stuff, big augmented reality towers into music festivals. So we were having to do stuff on hardware because I do hardware and software. So that was a bit different, but for most of the software gigs I do now, I do them remotely.
Yeah, I found if you're not working on custom stuff, working remote, you get, I'd say most of the time, just better productivity. I mean, we could have a whole conversation about this, but I find that most of the time, if stuff is set up right and you fire the people who aren't going to do any work from home and you get those people off the list, then remote work tends to be super productive.
It helps if you have some time to adjust for it and not throw everybody into pandemic emergency training.
I would imagine that helps a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. As someone who worked only remote for the past almost 8 years, I want to say it's perfectly fine. And as long as you get through the communication gaps, it can be very productive.
Yeah.
You're right. I admit it is kind of funny watching people I know kind of go stir crazy, and it's just there. You know, you're just laughing at them, going, "I've been doing this for like 5 or 6 years, and you have to work from home for 6 months, and you freak out."
Like, I haven't left this room since I was 22.
I did want to bring up that a common theme I see when people ask a question if they should move to another country is usually they talk about opportunity space, the average income for the place they're about to transfer to, and whether they have access to better living lifestyles. So even if game studios exist everywhere, the minimum wage, for example, would vary drastically depending on which country in America or anywhere you're going to be at. We're talking magnitudes of X10, and the living costs also scale. So it's really important to do your research pile, because go ahead.
It's also worth noting too, this is just one of those things you have to learn as a contractor, is people who hire you will try to hire you based on the rates of where you're from. So as an Irish developer, I get a lot of cheeky people who think they can hire me for a job that someone else would do, but no, he's in Ireland, he doesn't need as much money. It's like, no, if you're hiring me, you're paying me the rates for the job I do. It doesn't matter if I currently live in Ireland. This is not how this works. It's not like hiring an employee based on the rates of their living at the time. That's a different thing. Now, obviously, to give better context on that, if I've been offered jobs to move, and obviously the salary increases there, that's perfectly fine. If they want to hire me remotely full time, that's cheaper than if they were hiring me to move and I would have to pay the living costs of LA or whatever. But if you're paying someone as a freelancer or a contractor to do X number of hours of work, my hourly rate doesn't change because I'm sitting in a chair in Ireland versus a chair in LA. So.
Yeah,
don't want dollar bills, huh?
Yeah, you can break that out as well. Oh, yeah, I'm there. You can break that as well when you look at something like Facebook that is now turning around and saying if you want to work off campus, they're going to talk about reducing your salary down if you're going to be in a different state, because they have a part of their income is the fact that you have to work in San Francisco. And of course, the housing in San Francisco is ridiculous as far as the cost is concerned. So there are some cost of living adjustments that they do in some of those things. But as far as a straightforward wage is concerned, I agree with Joe's story completely. There shouldn't be a difference, but I think some of it derives from the fact that a lot of the game studios, especially when we got very big in AAA, you were hiring outsourcers from everywhere, and you were doing those outsourcer rates at a lot less. And now they think, oh, you're not in our country, you're an outsourcer, we're going to do these particular rates. And that's an old way of thinking that I think hopefully will change with a lot more people going remote.
But I guess the only reason I bring that up is to say that if you are looking to move, if someone asks you how much you want, you might be tempted to look at how much your job pays in your country and quote for that, which could be comical if you ask for an amount of money and then they're expecting you to move to, Ohio, and you're like, oh, cool, my cost of living just doubled, and I asked for an amount of money that would have been fine where I was, but now I'm earning like a fraction of what it is. So my point is, if you are looking to move country, find out what your job is worth in the country you're going to and where you're living, and make sure you're not quoting for what will make you poor when you get there. So.
Yeah, the cost of living is a huge thing. I remember when I first moved to California, we moved from a 3-bedroom house to a 2-bedroom apartment that was half the size and double the price. Right? And that was the best deal I could find that wasn't in a bad place. So it's definitely the cost of living in almost every place that has a lot of game studios is high, though. I'm trying to think of like a place that has like a big game industry, and they're all expensive. All of the West Coast, LA, San Francisco, San Diego, the Bay Area. Austin is no longer cheap either. Toronto is definitely not cheap. I think it's like the most expensive city in the country or the world or something ridiculous, or one of them. I keep seeing documentaries about it. So it's definitely you've got to look up there, get the numbers up high, and also look at the small regional differences. If you're looking at the United States, at least, like going 30 miles can be a double the cost of living increase. So just because it says it's in California doesn't necessarily mean it's in the same place of California where everything costs twice the price or whatever. So you got to be very specific on the areas and the drive and the distance and drive times, depending on where you're from. Drive times in the US and on the West Coast, like depending on where you're at. I know people that drive 2 hours a day to work and 2 hours from work. I think they're insane. I've done times where I had to drive for an hour a day to work, and I hated it. And it's just like you've got to think that through and price that in when you're looking at moving. So
yeah,
I worked briefly in New York in that, and I just it was such a culture shock for me. I'm like, I'm sorry, you're telling me I have to get up 2 hours earlier that I'm not being paid for the privilege of getting to the office? No, thank you. That's not something I want to do. I'm used to getting a bus outside, taking 10 minutes and making it to the office. I am not taking an extra 2 hours off my life just that I'm not getting, compensated for.
Here's a fun one. I don't have a driving license because Israel is so small that I can get from to the biggest city here in 40 minutes of driving, just paying the taxi. This is the worst case scenario I'll have. So there's no need.
Yeah, don't move to LA then, because you can't get anywhere without a car.
There'll be times where you spend 40 minutes to go a mile. You'll leave at the wrong time of day.
But that highlights the opposite too, right? And I think it's worth mentioning because people don't think about it this way. It's always the sexy answer to say you earn more or you get bigger in your industry, and so you move to the central hubs, and so you triple your costs. You hobnob with people, you go all the fancy meetups. But it is worth genuinely considering that if you are somebody who works remotely or as a contractor, sometimes it actually makes sense to move more remotely, because if you can get away with it, if your cost of living isn't you'd be amazed how, and I'm not even talking about moving to Ireland and living on a rock like I do. I mean, even just moving to the suburbs of an area where you are, is the difference could be you could half your cost of living and still earn the same money. Think about that. You could double your money for nothing other than just moving a bit down the road, effectively. So give it some genuine consideration that it's not just about moving for the sake of extra resources and access to people and whatever. There might be a justifiable case, depending on your job, that maybe you don't need that. Maybe you can even move out far enough that you can remote in or travel in when you need to. My friend Nick, for example, lives outside of London, and he works with people in London because every so often, once a week, going in for meetups for a few hours and paying the extra cost there means he can buy a much bigger house for him and his family and live much more comfortably than spending all that extra money for effectively real estate that doesn't mean anything to him because his office isn't in the center of town. He works remotely.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can do that with London because the transport's so good. I for a long time, I lived about an hour outside of London. And I just go out on the train in the morning, head into the studio. When I got married and my wife wanted to live in London, we moved up into that. And yeah, the price of property was mental. In fact, I have a much bigger house in LA than I do in London because London's astronomical as far as the property is concerned. Yeah. But the transport is so good there, you can live just outside London and still have a social life in London because it runs nearly all night as well. So whereas LA, you're going to drive everywhere, so your social life is limited a little bit if you drink.
Well, now there's not much going on in LA from what I've seen lately anyway.
No, there isn't. No.
It's all dead anyway.
Yep.
All right. Well, is there anything else you guys wanted to just briefly touch on before we get out of here?
I just wanted to say,
be streaming. What's that?
The big companies lately have been getting news articles all over the place about how they're going remote. I think Square Enix recently said they're going full remote. So just saying, this is the time if you want to get a remote job instead of having to travel around.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. Now is by far the easiest time to get into that.
I guess my only question is, because you said you were watching for about half an hour before you jumped on. Any thoughts on what we were talking about? I'm curious if you were sitting there like shouting at the screen or anything for something we were discussing.
No, I agree with everything you were going on about. I saw a little bit of the code review. It's still very early for me. I was working late, so watching people dig into code that deep when I'm half asleep is a little bit hard. But no, I agree with everything you're saying. There is only one point that I'd like to bring up, and that was when you're looking at serializing fields and you're doing get components and stuff like that, sometimes you have to think about, who's my audience as well? So some of the serialized field stuff was built towards designers and coders and all the rest. So make sure not to, if you expose everything, make sure to put tooltips in and things like that to make sure your designer doesn't go and start changing things and putting things around, because it will change the functionality and how you built the thing and how you see the scenes structured and how you look at your game manager to your other stuff. So there's a little bit there that is, am I building towards the designer? Am I building towards coders? And because I see a lot of coders use a lot more get component because they don't want to expose those things to designers that may go and change things, when they could expose them and then hide them off, like hide in inspector, or they could actually put in tooltips that line those things out, or headers that basically segregate those things off into different parts. So there is a little bit there for who are you designing the inspector for, because when you serialize a field, that's what you're doing. You're exposing it in the inspector, and you should think about who your audience is that you're doing that for. That's the only tip I'd put into that.
Yeah, and I would say, to go even one step further than that, that to me is the number one reason to learn editor tooling. It's not about the fancy toys. It's about the fact that you can make an executive decision about putting stuff in workable states. And I'm not even just talking about like different sliders and buttons. I am a big fan of what I just call like the fix button. And the fix button is, I make a script and it needs a reference to these three other things. I don't default to get component, but I have a button that says, if these are null, something's gone wrong, they shouldn't be null. I can literally draw in the editor, would you like me to try to fix this for you? And when you click that button, I will do my best guess to call various find objects of type or get components to fix it. That mightn't always work, but it means I am making an executive decision as a designer of my code to say, hey, you want to use this, you don't know how it works, look, you might have copied it and pasted it and something went wrong, just press this and I'll try and get it back for you. And you'd be amazed how even yourself coming back to your own code like months later going, oh, I built this camera system, how does it work? Click this to make it okay, click this to make okay, click, oh, it's good, it's working, fine. That's such a valuable thing that you don't appreciate until you've done it yourself.
And that's another reason to use the tooltip attribute. If I expose something, for myself, I have a thing that says if I expose something in the inspector, I have a tooltip for it. It's just something I do because, you work on a game for 2 years or something, you come back to it, as Jason's just saying, and you're like, what was I doing here? What's this thing going to do? It's named right. I think it does that, but a tooltip there gives you that extra layer, and as well as headers, putting those in.
Yeah.
So, you're all right. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, on the topic of tips, there's plenty we didn't get to reach out on, and we'll probably keep that for the next stream, right?
Yeah, I think that we've got like a big list of tips, but not enough time. So we'll go over a big tips episode next week, I guess. Maybe Dave can come by and bring a whole bunch of cool, useful Unity tips. I'll just wake him up really early. His wife wake him up super early in the morning next week.
Oh, she's lazier than I am. She's not gonna wake me up.
Oh man, I wish. My wife's up at like 4 a.m. So for me, it's like a struggle to stay asleep through her getting up and to fall back asleep or something. In the opposite boat. But all right, I just wanted to, I guess, wrap everything up, give Andrew a few minutes to start up his stream, and we'll send everybody over to there. I wish I could just automatically do it like Twitch does. It would be so nice. YouTube lets you push people over to a stream, but only your own. You can never just push them to somebody else's.
And just to show that it's a great segue, by the way, because some of the comments are, where do you learn editor scripting and stuff? Well, if you follow on to Andrew's stream, you will watch him do editor scripting. That is a good way to learn it.
Oh yeah, that's perfect. See some actual editor scripting that's not just example stuff, but actually being used and has some valid use cases. So I just linked it again in the chat. I guess thanks again, everybody, for coming out, joining us. Please hit the like button, hit subscribe, check out the courses and all the other links and stuff down below if you're interested in any of that stuff. And we'll see you again next week. Anybody got any? Oh, and definitely go to where I am never going to point the right direction. Go to Jason's coffee page and send him some drinks. I'm going to do that too afterwards. It's a weird inverted thing, because if it's not inverted, the text is inverted, and then it's all confusing. So, all right. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Any last words, anybody?
Nice to meet you, Dave.
and yeah, hopefully we'll see you again next week too, Dave. All right. Thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you later. Bye.
Bye.